This is 2 hours of disturbing Rick and Morty episode lore. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's start our video with a deep dive into the complete timeline of Evil Morty. Evil Morty is literally the most terrifying character in Rick and Morty, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. This guy spent years planning the biggest escape in multiverse history, and nobody saw it coming. He's essentially the only Morty who looked at his life and said, "Wait a minute, this is all nonsense," and then decided to destroy everything. I need to walk you through his whole story because when you see all 3 episodes together, it's actually insane how smart this guy was. We're talking about close Rick counters of the Rick kind, the Ricklantis mix-up, and Rick Mirai Jack. Each episode shows you a different part of his plan, and honestly, it's kind of scary how well he played everyone. So, back in Season 1, there's this evil Rick going around killing other Ricks. The council thinks it's our Rick doing it, so they arrest him and drag him to the Citadel. Already weird, right? Like, these are supposed to be the smartest people in existence, but they're so paranoid, they need a whole fortress city just to feel safe. But here's where it gets really messed up. This evil Rick has this dome covered in tortured Mortys. I'm talking hundreds of them, all strapped to the outside getting stabbed by machines constantly. The pain is so bad it creates this psychic field that hides him from other Ricks. One Morty can hide a Rick, but hundreds of Mortys screaming in agony? That's basically invisible to Rick detection. Our Rick figures out what's happening, and you know what he's most upset about? The bad craftsmanship. Not the torture, not the suffering, but the fact that you could do the same thing with way fewer Mortys. That should tell you everything about how Ricks think. When they finally find evil Rick, turns out he's not even really evil. He's got tech in his brain controlling him like a puppet. The real mastermind was hiding right there with all the other Mortys, acting scared and helpless. Evil Morty just blended in, wearing this fake eye patch to hide his transmitter. At the end, he walks away with everyone else, takes off the eye patch, crushes the transmitter, done. Nobody suspects anything because who would ever think a Morty could outsmart a Rick? The whole council was so sure they were superior that they couldn't imagine getting played by their own sidekicks. Years go by and everyone forgets about evil Morty. The Citadel rebuilds after Rick trashes most of the council, and they decide to try democracy. Multiple Rick candidates are running for president with their boring Rick policies. Then this random Morty decides to run too. The news anchors think it's hilarious. They're calling him adorable, making jokes about his little Morty suit, acting like it's some cute publicity stunt. Nobody takes him seriously at all. But evil Morty gets something they don't. Democracy is just another way to control people when they don't know what they're really voting for. He starts giving these speeches about unity and ending the divide between Ricks and Mortys. Talks about how the real enemy is the people keeping everyone divided. And you know what? His speeches actually make sense. He points out that Rick factory workers make way less than their bosses, even though they're literally identical with the same IQ. He talks about how Mortys get trained from birth to be sidekicks, and how the whole education system is designed to keep them submissive. While he's campaigning, there's all these other stories happening that seem random, but they're actually connected. This factory worker, Rick, gets passed over for promotion and loses it, takes hostages trying to get off the Citadel. These cop partners, one Rick, one Morty, dealing with corruption in the slums. 4 young Mortys looking for some mythical portal to escape their fate. Every single story shows the same thing. The Citadel is broken. It chews people up and spits them out. Ricks are stuck in dead-end jobs. Mortys get treated like garbage. Everyone's miserable, but nobody knows why. During the debate, evil Morty gives this amazing speech. While the Rick candidates are cracking jokes and talking policy, he speaks directly to everyone's pain. Says the real division is between people who want the Citadel divided and everyone else. It works. He wins by a landslide. Suddenly, this adorable Morty is running the most powerful organization in existence. But the second he takes office, everything changes. First thing he does is invite the Shadow Council to a meeting. These are the Ricks who've been really running things behind the scenes forever. They think they're gonna explain to the new Morty president how things actually work. Instead, evil Morty asks them one question. Does he really speak for everyone here? When they raise their hands to agree with their leader, he snaps his fingers. Armed guards shoot every Rick who raised their hand. Just like that. Leaves 2 survivors who are too scared to do anything but nod along. That's when you realize what he really is. He doesn't want reform or unity. He spent years learning the system, finding its weak spots, getting into position to destroy it from inside. By the time we get to Rick Mirai Jack, evil Morty's been president for a while, and he's ready for the final phase. But he needs something specific first. Rick C-137's brain scan. Our Rick knows stuff about the Citadel's dimensional drive that evil Morty needs for his weapon. So he sets a trap. Makes sure Morty gets that aging serum that turns him 40. Knows Rick will bring him to the Citadel to fix it. Everything's planned out. When they arrive, the Citadel looks totally different. Bright, clean, like a theme park instead of the dystopia it used to be. There's mascots and happy propaganda everywhere. Looks like evil Morty actually made things better. But underneath, something horrible is happening. Deformed Mortys are crawling out of sewers talking about death and destruction. When cops shoot one, he screams about how the Citadel is a weapon of mass destruction before they kill him. Evil Morty invites Rick to dinner and drops the truth. He's been using everyone as slave labor to make portal fluid while he prepares to break the central finite curve. That's the barrier keeping all realities limited to ones where Rick is the smartest person alive. During dinner, he does something that changes everything. Uses a brain scanner on Morty to show him the real truth about Rick and Morty relationships. Turns out most Ricks manipulate Jerry and Beth into getting together so they'll have grandsons to use as human shields. There's this whole industry making Mortys. Clone factories, brainwashing facilities, replacement services for when Mortys die on adventures. The Rick and Morty thing is a designed system of exploitation. When Morty sees this, he's destroyed. Everything he thought was special about his relationship with Rick is fake. He's livestock, bred to make Rick's life easier. But evil Morty's not done. He activates his real weapon. The entire Citadel is now a massive drill to punch through the central finite curve. Every portal gun in the city gets hacked, so instead of escape routes, they lead to death traps. Blender dimensions, flamethrowers, monsters. Thousands of Ricks and Mortys die trying to run. The city tears itself apart as his drill powers up. He's using everyone's life force to fuel the weapon. Even their backup clones get redirected to become battery power for the machine. As everything collapses, evil Morty flies his little spaceship toward the hole he tore in reality. He just wants out, sees that every Morty who stays loyal to Rick is trapped in endless abuse disguised as adventure. Rick and Morty barely escape on a chunk of the city. They watch the Citadel explode, knowing thousands just died to power one Morty's jailbreak. And evil Morty succeeds completely. He breaks through the central finite curve into the infinite multiverse where Rick isn't automatically the smartest person around. Destroys the Citadel, kills most of its population, proves the whole Rick and Morty relationship was engineered. But here's the really messed up part. Evil Morty might be right about everything. The central finite curve was basically a playpen, built around an infinite baby. Every Rick across infinite realities, stuck in the same behavior patterns, every Morty bred to enable it. Think about what that means for our Rick and Morty. Their adventures, their relationship, even Morty's family existing, it was all manipulated by Ricks. The show we've been watching is actually an abusive relationship disguised as comedy. Evil Morty saw through all that, realized the only way to win was to stop playing entirely, didn't want to fix the system or make it better, wanted to escape completely and find out what exists beyond the artificial limits placed on reality. The scariest part is he says every Morty who gets tired of Rick's behavior is evil Morty too. Says sooner or later, everyone inside the central finite curve reaches his conclusion. The system breaks people, and the only choice is accepting it or escaping it. When he steps through that golden portal into space beyond the curve, he's escaping the basic structure of reality that kept Rick at the center of everything. Years of planning the biggest prison break in history, and he actually pulled it off. Now that there's a hole in the central finite curve, who knows how many other Mortys might decide they've had enough of being sidekicks? Evil Morty proved escape is possible, and that might be his most dangerous legacy. Looking back at everything, evil Morty was never really evil in the normal sense. He was desperate, saw a rigged game, and decided to flip the table instead of playing by rules designed to make him lose. Whether that makes him villain or hero depends on how you feel about the thousands who died for his freedom. The thing that really gets me is how methodical evil Morty was about everything. Like in that first episode, he didn't just randomly pick evil Rick to control. He specifically chose someone who would be believable as a Rick gone rogue. Evil Rick had the right personality, the right backstory, the right motivations. Evil Morty studied the psychology of Ricks so well that he could predict exactly how they'd react to each situation. When Evil Rick was torturing all those Mortys on his dome, that was also a test. Evil Morty was seeing how the council would respond to mass Morty suffering. Would they be horrified by the torture or just annoyed by the inefficiency? Turns out it was the second one. That told him everything he needed to know about Rick morality. And think about the timing of his presidential campaign. He didn't run right after the Evil Rick incident when security would be tight. He waited years for everyone to get comfortable again. Let the Citadel rebuild. Let democracy become normal. Let people forget that a Morty had ever been a threat. Then he swooped in when their guard was down. His campaign strategy was brilliant too. He didn't promise things that sounded too good to be true. He didn't attack the Ricks directly. Instead, he focused on unity and bringing people together. Made himself seem harmless and idealistic. Classic political manipulation, but nobody expected it from a Morty. During his presidency, he had to maintain that facade while secretly preparing his weapon. Can you imagine how hard that must have been? Sitting through boring meetings, cutting ribbons, doing photo ops with sick Mortys, all while planning mass murder. The guy had incredible self-control. And the way he handled the Shadow Council meeting shows you how much he understood power dynamics. He didn't waste time arguing with them or trying to convince them. He just asked one simple question that forced them to reveal their loyalty, then eliminated them immediately. No speeches, no dramatic reveals, just efficient execution. The deformed Mortys crawling out of the sewers weren't random either. Those were probably the ones who figured out what was happening and tried to warn people. Evil Morty let a few escape on purpose so they could spread fear and chaos right before his final move. Psychological warfare. When he trapped Rick and Morty at dinner, he had everything perfectly planned. The brain scanner hidden in the table, the restraints in the chairs, the force field protecting him. But he also had backup plans. Multiple elite guards, portal gun hacks, the whole city turned into a death trap. He knew Rick would try to escape, and he was ready for every possible move. The brain scan he did on Morty was probably the cruelest part. He could have just taken what he needed from Rick and left, but he wanted Morty to understand the truth about his existence. wanted him to feel the same betrayal that evil Morty had felt. That's when you realize this was also about revenge. The factory scenes where Simple Rick gets used to flavor cookies are basically a preview of what evil Morty discovered about all Rick and Morty relationships. Simple Rick thinks he's remembering his daughter's birthday, but he's actually trapped in a loop while his brain chemicals get harvested. Sound familiar? That's exactly what happens to Mortys. They think they're having adventures, but they're actually just making Rick's life easier while their loyalty gets exploited. When evil Morty finally activated his weapon, every single system in the Citadel had been modified for his plan. The portal guns, the dimensional drive, the Operation Phoenix clones, even the city's basic infrastructure. He'd been working on this for years, probably from the moment he became president, maybe even from the moment he first controlled evil Rick. The most disturbing part is how he used everyone's survival instincts against them. The more they tried to escape, the more power they fed into his weapon. Their desperation literally fueled their own destruction. That takes a special kind of twisted genius to design. His escape ship was probably built in secret using Citadel resources. While everyone thought he was governing, he was actually constructing his getaway vehicle. The golden portal gun he used at the end was probably custom-made too. Everything about his escape was planned down to the last detail. When he finally broke through the central finite curve, he didn't look back, didn't gloat, didn't make a speech, didn't try to justify what he'd done. Just stepped through that portal and disappeared into infinite possibilities. That's the mark of someone who's completely committed to their choice. But here's what really scares me about the whole thing. Evil Morty succeeded because he was willing to do what other Mortys weren't. He was willing to kill innocent people, manipulate democracy, destroy entire civilizations. He became the monster he was fighting against, just in a different direction. Now every Morty in the remaining multiverse knows that escape is possible, but they also know the price. How many other Mortys are going to look at evil Morty's example and think, maybe genocide is worth it for freedom? How many are going to decide that their Rick deserves to die along with everyone else who enables the system? The central finite curve might be broken, but the psychological damage evil Morty caused could last forever. He proved that Mortys can be just as ruthless as Ricks when they put their minds to it. That's a terrifying precedent to set. But one thing's certain, evil Morty changed everything. The Rick and Morty universe will never be the same, and every Morty still stuck inside the central finite curve now knows escape is possible. They just have to be willing to pay the price. Now let's move to every version of Rick ranked by power. Look, I'm gonna be honest with you. After watching Rick get cloned about 50 times and seeing most of those clones die horribly, I figured out something that nobody talks about. Not all Ricks are the same. Some are basically gods, others can't tie their shoes without blowing up a planet. Rick C-137 acts like every Rick is equally smart, but the episodes show there's actually a huge gap between different versions of him. It's pretty wild when you really think about it. In Mortyplicity, Rick makes decoy families to protect himself from his enemies. Sounds smart until the decoys start making their own decoys. Then those decoys make more decoys. Suddenly, you've got this whole mess of fake Ricks killing each other, and each generation gets progressively worse at being Rick. The first decoys were actually pretty decent. They had his memories, his attitude, most of his brains. But as you go down the chain, things get weird fast. You've got the Wooden family who were surprisingly organized and tactical about the whole murder spree thing. Then way down at the bottom, you've got Scarecrow Rick, who's basically just wearing other people's skin and has completely lost the plot. That's something interesting about intelligence. It's not just about being smart, it's about making good choices under pressure. Scarecrow Rick had Rick's confidence but lacked his actual problem-solving skills. He shows what happens when you get the attitude without the ability to back it up. Here's where it gets really interesting though. The decoy cascade reveals something most people miss. Each generation get more desperate. The Wooden family weren't just trying to survive the decoy war. They were trying to prove they deserve to exist. That desperation makes them predictable, and ultimately gets them killed. The higher-tier decoys actually showed remarkable creativity in their survival strategies. Some went into hiding and built elaborate defenses. Others tried to form alliances with different decoy families. A few even attempted to break the cycle by refusing to participate in the violence altogether. What's really fascinating is that the most successful decoys weren't necessarily the ones with the best technology or the most accurate Rick memories. They were the ones who could adapt their strategies based on new information. The Wooden family lasted as long as they did because they learned from watching other decoys get eliminated. This reveals something crucial about Rick's intelligence. It's not just raw processing power or scientific knowledge. The Wooden decoys had access to most of Rick's technical skills, but they lacked his psychological flexibility. They could build death rays, but they couldn't think outside conventional warfare tactics. Rick C-137 never has to prove anything to anyone. He just does what he wants and deals with the consequences. Other Ricks are constantly justifying their existence, which is a fatal weakness. They'll always pick the option that makes them feel legitimate, even when it's clearly the wrong move. The decoy families that survived longest were the ones who could accept uncertainty about their own identity. They didn't waste mental energy worrying about whether they were real enough. They just focused on staying alive and achieving their goals. Rick-dependent spray shows us something different but equally important about Rick's power level. The guy accidentally turns horse reproductive material into world-ending monsters that threaten all of humanity. Most scientists would call that a career-ending mistake. For Rick, it's Tuesday morning before coffee. But here's what separates him from weaker Ricks. Instead of panicking and trying to science his way out of the problem, he adapts. The The guy fixes the situation by marrying a horse princess and ending a centuries-long war between species. That's the ability to think outside conventional solutions. Any other Rick would have built some elaborate device or tried to reverse the process scientifically. Our Rick uses politics and weird interspecies romance. That flexibility is what separates top-tier Ricks from the wannabes. Lower-level Ricks think every problem needs a scientific solution. Rick C-137 will use whatever actually works. Think about the CHUD situation specifically. Rick accidentally gets someone pregnant, and suddenly there's peace between warring factions. That's rolling with complete chaos and somehow making it work in your favor. Most Ricks would never put themselves in that position because it requires admitting you don't control everything. But Rick's willingness to embrace randomness and work with it instead of against it is exactly what makes him more powerful than his alternates. The really clever part is how Rick turns his mistakes into advantages. The giant sperm monsters weren't part of any plan, but Rick immediately starts thinking about how to use the situation to his benefit. Weaker Ricks get stuck trying to undo their errors instead of leveraging them. This suggests that Rick's power is about being able to process failure, learn from mistakes, and adjust your approach without getting emotionally attached to any particular method. Most Ricks get stuck using the same solutions over and over because they worked once. Edge of Morty gives us the clearest power ranking because we literally watch alternate Ricks replace him when he dies. Every single replacement has some fatal flaw that proves they're inferior to the original. Fascist Rick is too obsessed with politics. Wasp Rick is too nice and empathetic. They all know deep down they're not the real Rick, which tells you something about Rick's intelligence being objectively measurable. The Death Crystal subplot is key here. Rick refuses to use them because he knows predictability is weakness. The crystals show you a path to the death you want, but following that path makes you predictable to enemies. Weak Ricks plan obsessively for survival. Strong Ricks adapt to whatever actually happens. That confidence in his ability to handle unknown situations is what separates Rick from basically everyone else. He doesn't need to know what's coming because he trusts himself to deal with it when it arrives. The replacement Ricks all showed some form of anxiety about the future or attachment to specific outcomes. The replacement Ricks in Edge of Morty all had different approaches to being a grandfather. Some were more controlling, others were more distant, a few tried to be friendlier than the original, but none of them could maintain the specific balance that Rick C-137 has with his family. They either cared too much and became vulnerable, or cared too little and lost the family's cooperation. Rick's ability to stay connected but not dependent seems to be a rare skill among his alternates. This emotional calibration is actually a form of intelligence that most people don't recognize. A Rick Convenient Mort demonstrates emotional control as a form of power. While Morty completely falls apart over his relationship with Planetina, Rick stays detached and functional. When Summer breaks his rules about staying emotionally unattached and their whole adventure starts falling apart, Rick immediately cuts ties with Daphne before it gets worse. That emotional discipline is what most other Ricks completely lack. They get attached to people or outcomes, and it makes them vulnerable. Rick C-137 has learned to care about his family while still maintaining the distance he needs to make rational decisions. The Wine Dimensions subplot actually demonstrates this principle on a larger scale. Rick sends Morty to get wine, knowing that interdimensional travel often causes unintended consequences. But instead of trying to prevent all possible problems, Rick just deals with whatever actually happens. This approach seems wasteful when you focus on the civilizations that get affected, but from a strategic perspective, it's incredibly efficient. Rick gets what he needs without spending time on elaborate planning for scenarios that might never occur. Most Ricks would spend months developing safety protocols and miss opportunities. But here's something interesting about this whole power dynamic. Rick seems to have created this gap intentionally. By choosing not to help other versions of himself and actively competing with them, he maintains his advantage. Every time another Rick struggles, it reinforces his approach. That's pretty strategic when you think about it, but it's also brilliant from a competitive standpoint. He's actively making them weaker by denying them resources and support. It's like being in a race where you're also creating obstacles for the other runners. What makes this ranking system so brutal is that most Ricks think they're near the top when they're actually way lower on the hierarchy. The decoys all genuinely believe they're the real Rick until someone proves them wrong. That self-deception probably gets most alternate Ricks killed in situations where they overestimate their abilities. The toxic Rick from Rest and Ricklaxation actually helps illustrate this point. When all of Rick's positive traits were removed, what remained was also rigid thinking and emotional instability. The toxic version couldn't adapt because he was too invested in proving he was right about everything. Meanwhile, the healthy Rick became too detached and lost his motivation to solve complex problems. This suggests that Rick's power comes from maintaining tension between opposing psychological forces rather than resolving that tension in either direction. Rick C-137 stays dominant because he never assumes he's the smartest person around, even when he usually is. He plans for the possibility that someone might be better than him and always has backup plans. Other Ricks get overconfident and make stupid mistakes that get them killed. The really fascinating part is how this affects Rick's relationship with other versions of himself. Most Ricks seem to view their alternates as either competition or resources to be exploited. But Rick C-137 treats them more like interesting experiments that he can learn from. When he encounters other Ricks who are more specialized in certain areas, he doesn't try to compete with them directly. Instead, he observes their methods and incorporates useful techniques into his own approach. This willingness to learn from others Even versions of himself gives him advantages that more prideful Ricks miss. The power ranking also reveals something about how intelligence scales in extreme situations. Regular smart people hit a ceiling where additional intelligence doesn't provide proportional benefits. But at Rick's level, small differences in capability can have massive consequences. A slightly less adaptable Rick might survive most situations but fail catastrophically when facing a truly unpredictable opponent. A Rick who's marginally more attached to his ego might make one crucial mistake that gets his entire family killed. The margins between different power levels become razor thin at the top. This creates a strange situation where Rick has to constantly evolve his methods to stay ahead of other versions of himself who are also learning and adapting. It's like an arms race where all the participants share the same basic personality and knowledge base. The decoy cascade illustrates this perfectly. Each generation of decoys had to develop new strategies because the old ones stopped working. But eventually, they ran out of psychological flexibility and started repeating patterns that made them vulnerable. Rick C-137 seems to have avoided this trap by maintaining his curiosity and willingness to experiment. While other Ricks become more set in their ways over time, he keeps trying new approaches, even when his current methods are working fine. The really scary thing, though, is that Rick might not even be the strongest Rick in existence. We've only seen a tiny fraction of infinite possible Ricks. There could be versions out there that make our Rick look like he's still in elementary school. Maybe there's a Rick who completely removed his emotions and operates with pure logic, or one who's so far ahead technologically that he doesn't need to fight anyone anymore because he's transcended conflict entirely. There might be Ricks who have figured out how to manipulate reality itself instead of just building devices. Some of those hypothetical Ricks might have solved the psychological problems that still trip up Rick C-137. Maybe there's a version who figured out how to care about his family without any emotional vulnerability, or a Rick who can predict chaos instead of just adapting to it. The fact that Rick C-137 still struggles with daily problems and gets surprised by things suggests he hasn't reached peak Rick power. He's just the best version we've encountered so far. The power ranking system we see in these episodes might be the bottom tier of an even bigger hierarchy we haven't discovered yet. Most Ricks are smart enough to be dangerous to everyone around them. Only a few are smart enough to be truly unstoppable forces. But somewhere out there in the infinite multiverse, there might be Ricks who make unstoppable look like child's play. And honestly, that possibility is what keeps Rick C-137 moving forward. He knows there's always someone potentially better than him, which is why he never stops trying to improve his own capabilities. The moment he decides he's reached the top is the moment a stronger Rick shows up to prove him wrong. The power ranking between Ricks is about adaptability, emotional control, willingness to embrace chaos, and the psychological strength to keep functioning when everything goes wrong. Rick C-137 excels in all these areas, but he's probably not perfect at any of them. That imperfection might actually be his greatest strength. Perfect Ricks would be predictable. Rick C-137's flaws and inconsistencies make him harder to counter, which keeps him ahead of more perfect versions of himself who are easier to outmaneuver. Maybe that's the real secret to his power ranking. It's not that he's objectively smarter than every other Rick, it's that he's better at staying mentally flexible as he accumulates experience. Most highly intelligent people become more rigid over time because they learn what works and stick with it. But Rick operates in situations where what worked yesterday might get you killed tomorrow. His environment rewards psychological adaptability over raw intellectual horsepower. That's why some of the dumber Ricks who stayed flexible outlasted smarter ones who became predictable. The ranking system these episodes reveal is about psychological resilience, adaptability, and the ability to function effectively while maintaining contradictory mental states simultaneously. Rick just happens to be unusually good at all of these things. In the end, ranking Ricks by power reveals something pretty complex about intelligence and capability. The strongest Rick is the one who can balance competing demands, adapt to chaos, and maintain psychological flexibility while everyone else gets stuck in patterns that eventually get them killed. Now let's talk about the lost universe where Rick died. Rick treats entire universes like rental cars. He breaks them, abandons them, and moves on without looking back. But what happens to the realities he leaves behind? These episodes show us something pretty disturbing about how Rick operates and what it means for the families he ditches. The whole thing starts when Rick makes Morty a love potion that goes horribly wrong. Classic Rick move, right? Morty wants Jessica to fall for him, so Rick whips up some chemical that makes anyone who smells it obsessed with Morty. Sounds simple enough until Jessica has the flu and the potion goes airborne. Within hours, the entire planet is infected. Every person on Earth except Rick and Morty is trying to seduce and then eat Morty. The love potion mixed with flu symptoms created this weird mating ritual where people wanted to reproduce with Morty and then kill him afterward. Rick's solution? Make another serum based on praying mantis DNA, because mantises are the opposite of the voles he used originally. Obviously, that makes everything worse. Now, instead of love-crazed humans, Earth is populated by horrifying flesh monsters called Cronenbergs. These things are basically walking nightmares with multiple limbs, eyes everywhere, and an insatiable hunger for violence. The entire human race has been transformed into abominations. Rick's response to this global catastrophe is basically, whoops, my bad. He doesn't try to fix it or save anyone. He just tells Morty they need to find a reality where they solve the problem, but then died shortly after. That way they can slip into their dead counterparts' lives and nobody will know the difference. They literally bury their own corpses in the backyard and take over their lives. Morty is traumatized by this, but Rick treats it like changing clothes. He's done this before, and he'll do it again. The scary part is how casual he is about abandoning an entire planet full of people who trusted him. But here's what really gets me. In the reality they left behind, Jerry and Beth become these amazing survivors. Without Rick around to make them feel stupid and worthless, they actually step up. Jerry becomes this tough warrior wielding crowbars and shotguns. Beth discovers she's incredibly capable in crisis situations. They work together as a team and genuinely seem happier despite living in a monster apocalypse. Summer straight up says the family is better off without Rick. She admits they're finally happy now that he's gone. That's a pretty harsh judgment, but when you think about it, she's probably right. Rick's presence in their lives causes constant chaos and makes everyone feel inadequate. The abandoned Smith family learns to thrive in their Cronenberg world. They become these tough survivors who actually care about each other. Meanwhile, the real Rick and Morty slip back into a normal life where nobody knows what happened. Rick gets all the benefits of having a family without dealing with the consequences of his actions. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Think about what this means for all the other versions of the Smith family across the multiverse. How many times has Rick done this exact thing? How many realities are out there where families had to rebuild their entire lives because Rick showed up, destroyed everything, and then vanished? The crazy part is that each abandoned family probably has their own unique survival story. Some might become warriors like Jerry and Beth did. Others might find completely different ways to adapt. Maybe some families discover hidden talents or strengths they never knew they had when Rick wasn't around to overshadow them. Rick acts like he's doing these families a favor by being their patriarch, but the evidence suggests they're better off without him. The abandoned realities keep functioning and even thriving after he leaves. That suggests Rick isn't actually as necessary as he pretends to be. Rest and Ricklaxation shows us a different kind of abandonment. Rick and Morty go through this detox process that removes their toxic traits. The problem is, the machine doesn't know what's actually toxic versus what they think is toxic, so it creates these separate beings made of all their worst qualities. The toxic versions get trapped in this wasteland inside the machine. Toxic Rick is pure ego and cruelty, without any of the intelligence that makes regular Rick functional. Toxic Morty is just pure self-loathing and anxiety. They're suffering constantly in this prison Rick accidentally created. Meanwhile, the detoxed versions are living their best lives. Rick becomes this polite, reasonable person who apologizes for being rude. Morty turns into this confident guy who can talk to anyone and becomes successful at everything, but they're missing crucial parts of their personalities. The healthy Morty starts dating this woman named Stacy and becomes a stockbroker. He's successful but completely emotionally detached. When Rick tracks him down, Morty has become this sociopathic businessman who doesn't care about anyone. He literally tells Jessica he doesn't need her love because he's not sick enough to want it anymore. Here's the twisted part, though. The episode reveals that Rick's toxic traits include things like his attachment to Morty and his sense of responsibility. Without those toxic qualities, he becomes someone who can casually shoot Morty multiple times to force the toxic versions to cooperate. The toxins are what make them human, basically. This raises some wild questions about what it means to be healthy versus toxic. Rick's love for his family is technically a toxic trait according to the machine, but it's also what makes him care about their welfare. The detoxed version doesn't have that emotional investment, which makes him more effective but also more dangerous. The toxic versions represent all the pain and dysfunction that comes with caring about people. They're miserable, but they're also more human in some ways. The detoxed versions are successful and confident, but they've lost the messy emotional connections that give life meaning. Mort Dinner. Rick Andre gives us the most complex example of Rick abandoning realities. Morty gets trapped in this Narnia-like dimension where time moves faster. He keeps trying to get wine for Rick's dinner with his nemesis Mr. Nimbus, but every time he goes through the portal, decades pass in the wine dimension. At first, Morty just wants to complete his simple task, but each time he returns, he's caused massive changes in this other world. The people there start worshipping him as some kind of prophet or demon depending on their perspective. Entire civilizations rise and fall around Morty's brief visits. What's really heartbreaking is watching how these civilizations develop around Morty's appearances. They build religions, prepare for his return, create entire cultures based on brief encounters with him. Some see him as a savior, others as a destroyer, but to Morty, he's just trying to get some wine for dinner. The people in the wine dimension have rich, complex lives that span generations. They fall in love, have children, build societies, create art, but all of it gets swept away by Morty's casual visits. Their entire existence revolves around someone who barely notices they exist. By the end, Morty has accidentally destroyed multiple generations of this civilization. There's this character who gets frozen in time for what feels like eternity, experiencing the loneliness of infinite existence. She gains this cosmic perspective on how meaningless individual lives are in the grand scheme of things. The really messed up part is that Rick knows this kind of thing happens. He's aware that his casual use of interdimensional technology destroys lives and entire civilizations. But he does it anyway because his immediate needs are more important than the suffering he causes. Each time Rick abandons a universe, he leaves behind people who have to deal with the consequences of his actions. The Cronenberg reality, the toxic wasteland, the wine dimension, they're all populated with beings who are suffering because Rick was too selfish or careless to clean up his messes. What makes this really disturbing is that Rick is probably the only person who could fix these problems. He has the intelligence and technology to help these abandoned universes. But he chooses not to because it's easier to just move on to a new reality where the problems don't exist. think about the practical implications of this. Rick has access to infinite realities, which means he can literally afford to be as careless as he wants. Made a mistake? Just hop to a universe where you didn't make that mistake. Destroyed a civilization? Find one where they're still alive. It's the ultimate safety net, but it only works for Rick. The abandoned realities also raise questions about identity and continuity. If Rick can just replace himself with another version who made better choices, what does that say about personal responsibility? Is he the same person as the Rick who destroyed the Cronenberg world? Or is that a different guy entirely? From Rick's perspective, these are just course corrections. He messed up, found a reality where he didn't mess up, and continued with his life. No harm, no foul. But that perspective only works if you don't consider the abandoned realities to be real in the same way. The show seems to suggest that all these realities are equally valid and important. The abandoned families are real people living real lives in worlds that Rick destroyed and forgot about. That makes Rick's behavior pretty monstrous when you really think about it. But Rick keeps inserting himself into new versions of his family because he's addicted to being needed. He creates problems that only he can solve, then acts like a hero for solving them. It's this sick cycle where he generates chaos just so he can be the smartest person in the room. The Lost universes are proof that Rick's adventures aren't actually as consequence-free as he pretends. Every decision he makes ruins lives on a massive scale. He's destroying entire realities and abandoning them when things get complicated. The fact that he can do this infinitely means there's probably countless versions of these abandoned realities scattered across the multiverse. Entire universes where Rick showed up, destroyed everything, and left. Each one populated by people who trusted him and got screwed over for it. Maybe the most disturbing part is that Rick probably doesn't even remember most of them. These universe-ending catastrophes are just Tuesday for him. But for the people living in those realities, it's the most important thing that ever happened to them. They're still dealing with the aftermath, while Rick has moved on to ruining someone else's life. The abandoned universes also make the abandoned realities kind of hopeful in a weird way. These are stories about people finding strength they didn't know they had when everything went wrong. They're about families pulling together in crisis and discovering they're more capable than they realized. Maybe that's the real message here. Rick thinks he's essential to his family's survival, but the abandoned realities prove he's not. People are resilient and adaptable. They can overcome almost anything, even having their entire universe transformed into a nightmare wasteland. The Lost universes where Rick died, whether literally or figuratively, show us what the world looks like without him. And honestly, it looks pretty good. Now we'll talk about the dark truth about Cronenberg Earth. But before I tell you about that, subscribe to our channel. Rick abandoning entire realities is probably the most messed up thing about the whole show, and Cronenberg Earth is the perfect example of how he treats universes like they're disposable. What happened there should keep you up at night if you really think about it. So Rick makes this love potion for Morty because the kid wants Jessica to notice him. Pretty standard grandfather helping grandson stuff, right? Except Rick being Rick, he doesn't test it properly or think about what could go wrong. The potion works too well and spreads like wildfire when it goes airborne because Jessica has the flu. Within hours, literally every human on the planet is infected. They all want Morty in this twisted way where they're trying to seduce him and then eat him afterward. It's this horrifying mix of love and cannibalism that shows just how dangerous Rick's casual approach to science really is. Rick's brilliant solution? Make another serum to fix the first one, because that always works out great. He uses praying mantis DNA thinking it'll counteract the Vole DNA from the original potion. Instead, he transforms every single human being into grotesque flesh monsters called Cronenbergs. Cronenbergs are conscious beings trapped in horrific mutated bodies. They have multiple limbs growing out of random places, eyes scattered across their flesh, and this constant hunger for violence. Every person on Earth became one of these things because Rick couldn't be bothered to think through his science experiment. But here's the really disturbing part. Rick doesn't even try to fix what he did. His solution is to find a reality where they solved the Cronenberg problem, but then died shortly after. That way, they can just slip into their dead counterparts' lives and pretend nothing happened. Think about what that means for the Smith family they left behind. Jerry, Beth, and Summer had to watch their entire world transform into a nightmare. Everyone they knew, every friend, neighbor, co-worker turned into a flesh monster overnight. Their entire civilization collapsed because Rick wanted to help his grandson get a date. And then Rick and Morty just vanished. One day they're there trying to fix the problem, the next day they're gone forever. The family has no idea what happened to them. For all they know, Rick and Morty got eaten by Cronenbergs or died trying to find a cure. They probably spent months hoping they'd come back. But something interesting happens in that abandoned reality. Without Rick around to make them feel worthless and incompetent, the Smith family actually becomes amazing. Jerry transforms from this pathetic loser into a legitimate badass. He's wielding crowbars and shotguns, making tactical decisions, keeping his family alive in a world full of monsters. Beth discovers she's incredibly capable in crisis situations. She becomes this tough survivor who can handle extreme stress and make life or death decisions. Summer adapts to the new reality and becomes resourceful in ways she never had to be before. The abandoned Smith family thrive. They work together as a team, support each other through trauma, and actually seem genuinely happy despite living in literal hell. Summer even says they're better off without Rick, which is a pretty harsh judgment but probably accurate. Mortyplicity shows us this pattern repeats constantly. Rick creates decoy families to protect himself from enemies, but some of those decoys don't know they're decoys. They think they're the real family and they're just trying to live normal lives. When the decoy war starts and they all start killing each other, Rick doesn't care about the innocent decoys who get caught in the crossfire. These decoy families have real relationships and emotions. They care about each other, they have inside jokes and shared memories. But Rick treats them like they're worthless because they're not the real family. He watches them get systematically hunted down and murdered without lifting a finger to help. What makes this especially twisted is that some of the decoys are probably better people than the originals. They have all the same personalities and relationships, but without some of Rick's worst influences. Maybe some decoy Ricks are actually decent grandfathers who don't constantly endanger their families. Edge of Morty takes this concept even further. When Rick dies and gets replaced by alternate versions of himself, we see that most of these replacement Ricks are actually worse than the original. They're more violent, more selfish, less competent at keeping the family safe. But that raises some uncomfortable questions about which Rick deserves to be the real one. If Rick C-137 dies and gets replaced by a Rick who treats the family better, isn't that actually an improvement? The family wouldn't know the difference, and they might be happier with a kinder version of their grandfather. The dark truth about Cronenberg Earth is that it proves Rick's presence in his family's life might actually be harmful. The abandoned Smiths became stronger, more united, and happier after he left. They learned to solve problems together instead of relying on Rick to fix everything with science. Rick acts like he's protecting his family and taking them on amazing adventures, but the evidence suggests they're better off without him. Every time he abandons a reality, that reality finds a way to function and even improve without his interference. The ethical nightmare here is that Rick has infinite realities to choose from, which means he never has to face consequences for his actions. Made a mistake? Just hop to a universe where you didn't make that mistake. Destroyed a civilization? Find one where they're still alive. But the people in the abandoned realities don't have that luxury. They're stuck dealing with whatever catastrophe Rick caused. The Cronenberg Smith family had to rebuild their entire lives around surviving in a monster apocalypse because Rick was careless with a love potion. And here's what really gets me. Rick probably doesn't even remember most of the realities he's abandoned. These universe-ending disasters are just Tuesday for him. But for the people living in those realities, it's the most important thing that ever happened to them. The abandoned families are still out there somewhere in the infinite multiverse. The Cronenberg Smiths are probably still fighting monsters and growing stronger as a family unit. The decoy families who survived the war are still trying to figure out why everyone they knew suddenly started killing each other. Rick treats these realities like they're not real or important, but the show suggests they're just as valid as any other universe. These are real people living real lives in worlds that Rick casually destroyed and forgot about. What makes Cronenberg Earth especially disturbing is that it was completely preventable. Rick had the knowledge and ability to make a safe love potion. He just couldn't be bothered to do it right. His laziness and arrogance directly caused the suffering of billions of people. The abandoned realities also raise questions about identity and responsibility. Is Rick C-137 the same person as the Rick who created the Cronenberg apocalypse? If he can just replace himself with a version who made better choices, does that absolve him of guilt for his past mistakes? From Rick's perspective, these are just course corrections. He messed up, found a reality where he didn't mess up, and continued with his life. No harm, no foul, right? But that perspective only works if you don't consider the abandoned realities to be real in the same way. And that's exactly how Rick thinks about it. To him, there's only one reality that matters, the one he's currently living in. Everything else is just background noise. The show challenges that perspective by showing us what happens in the abandoned realities after Rick leaves. These are full of people who have to live with the consequences of his actions. Maybe the most hopeful part of Cronenberg Earth is that it shows people can overcome almost anything. The Smith family didn't just survive the apocalypse, they found strength and unity they never had before. They discovered they were more capable and resilient than they realized. But that hope comes at a terrible cost. They had to lose everything, including Rick and Morty, to discover their own potential. And somewhere in another reality, Rick is still making the same mistakes with a different version of the same family. The dark truth about Cronenberg Earth is that he's probably done it countless times before, and will do it again. Because when you have infinite realities to choose from, why take responsibility for your mistakes when you can just run away and start over? The ethical nightmare of treating realities as disposable is about what it does to Rick himself. When actions don't have permanent consequences, when you can always undo your mistakes by finding a better timeline, what incentive do you have to grow as a person or learn from your errors? Rick's ability to abandon realities has made him emotionally stunted and morally bankrupt. He never has to face the full weight of his actions because he can always escape to a world where those actions didn't happen. But the people he leaves behind don't have that luxury. They have to live with what Rick did to them for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on the abandoned families is something the show barely touches on, but it's probably the most disturbing aspect of this whole thing. Imagine being Summer in the Cronenberg reality. One day, you're a normal teenager worried about school and boys. The next day, literally everyone you've ever known has been transformed into a flesh monster because your grandpa made a love potion. Your friends, your teachers, your first crush, that barista you had a crush on, all of them are now grotesque creatures trying to kill you. Every familiar face in your life has been replaced by a nightmare. The trauma from that level of loss would break most people, but Summer and her family had to push through it just to survive. And then there's the psychological warfare aspect that Rick probably never considered. In Mortyplicity, we see how the decoy families react when they start getting hunted. These families genuinely believe they're real, which means they experience real terror when they're being systematically murdered by other versions of themselves. Imagine being a decoy Jerry who thinks he's the real Jerry. You're just trying to live your normal life when suddenly other versions of your family start showing up and trying to kill you. You have no idea why this is happening or who you can trust. Some of the decoy families probably spent their final moments thinking their own family members had gone insane. The decoy families that survived the war are probably dealing with severe trust issues now. How do you go back to normal family life when you've seen other versions of yourself commit murder? How do you look at your spouse and kids and not wonder if they might be decoys too? Rick created an entire population of people with identical trauma, multiple Smith families all dealing with the same impossible situation but completely isolated from each other. They can't even talk to therapists about it because no therapist would believe their story. What's really twisted is that Rick probably has the technology to help these abandoned realities if he wanted to. He could develop a cure for the Cronenberg virus, or provide therapy for the decoy families dealing with interdimensional PTSD. But he doesn't because helping them would require admitting he was wrong. Rick's ego is so massive that he can't acknowledge the suffering he's caused. If he went back to fix the Cronenberg world, he'd have to face Jerry and Beth and admit that his science experiment destroyed their entire civilization. He'd rather pretend they don't exist than deal with that level of accountability. There's also the question of whether Rick's replacements in abandoned realities are even the same person. When Rick dies in Edge of Morty and gets replaced by alternate versions, the family doesn't notice the difference. But those replacement Ricks have different memories and experiences. The replacement Rick didn't create the Cronenberg apocalypse, but he's benefiting from the original Rick's decision to abandon that reality. He gets to live in a nice, normal world while another version of his family is still fighting monsters in a wasteland. That seems pretty unfair when you think about it. The abandoned realities also reveal something dark about the multiverse itself. If there are infinite versions of every person, does individual suffering actually matter? Rick seems to think it doesn't, because there's always another version of everyone living a better life somewhere else. But that logic falls apart when you consider that each version is a complete person with their own consciousness and experiences. The Cronenberg Jerry is a unique individual who has lived through trauma that regular Jerry never experienced. His pain is real, even if there are infinite other Jerrys who never went through it. Rick uses the infinity of the multiverse as an excuse to avoid moral responsibility. He can always point to a reality where things worked out better and pretend that somehow balances out the realities where he caused massive suffering. But math doesn't work like that when you're talking about conscious beings. The most chilling part is that Rick probably isn't even the worst version of himself out there. If there are infinite Ricks, there are definitely versions who are more cruel, more careless, more willing to sacrifice entire realities for minor conveniences. The multiverse is probably littered with realities that various Ricks have destroyed and abandoned. Some of those abandoned realities probably never recovered like the Cronenberg Smiths did. Maybe some families just gave up and died. Maybe some went insane from the trauma. Maybe some turned into monsters themselves just to survive in the worlds Rick created. The really scary thought is that this could happen to our Rick's family at any time. If he ever makes a mistake big enough, he might just abandon them too and find a replacement family in a reality where he didn't mess up. They would never know they'd been replaced by better versions of themselves. Rick's casual attitude toward abandonment has created a multiverse full of trauma and suffering that he refuses to acknowledge. Every abandoned reality is a monument to his selfishness and inability to take responsibility for his actions. And the worst part is, he's probably going to keep doing it, because why would he stop when there are always more realities to ruin? Now let's talk about what the portal gun really means. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Rick's portal gun first appears in the pilot when he drags Morty out of bed for a surprise that turns out to be dropping a neutrino bomb on Earth. But here's the thing that everyone misses. Rick only feels comfortable threatening to destroy the entire planet because he knows he can just hop to another dimension if things go wrong. The portal gun gives him the power to treat every world as disposable. When Morty fights him for control of the ship and they crash in the desert, Rick reveals something crucial. He tells Morty the whole bomb thing was just a test to make him more assertive. But then, he immediately falls asleep, leaving a neutrino bomb armed and ready to explode. Rick literally forgot he was about to destroy Earth because to him, consequences don't exist anymore. The portal gun has broken Rick's ability to care about outcomes because he can always just portal away from any problem. In the pilot, we see him casually send Morty through interdimensional customs with mega seeds shoved up his butt. When security catches them, Rick just starts shooting and tells Morty to run because he knows they can escape to another dimension. The Wedding Squanchers shows us what happens when Rick finally can't just portal away from his problems. When Tammy reveals she's a Federation agent and kills Bird Person, Rick is trapped. His portal gun is useless because the entire galaxy is hunting him now. For the first time in years, Rick has to face real consequences. The wedding scene is heartbreaking because you can see Rick genuinely trying to be a good friend. He makes a toast about opening himself up to others and loving Tammy because Bird Person loves her. But the portal gun has made him so used to escaping that he never learned how to actually deal with betrayal or loss. When Jerry suggests turning Rick in to get their normal life back, Rick makes the ultimate sacrifice. He turns himself in, calling the Federation and pretending to be Jerry. But even this noble gesture is tainted by the portal gun. Rick tells the agent, "I love sucking big sweaty boners and licking disgusting furry testicle sacks," because he can't resist trolling even when he's sacrificing himself. The really tragic part is that Rick's family gets exactly what Jerry wanted. They go back to Earth and get normal jobs under Federation rule. Jerry is happy taking antidepressants and working his assigned job. But the cost is Rick sitting alone in a space prison, completely cut off from the infinite multiverse he used to command. Rick-ternal Friendshine reveals the deeper psychological damage the portal gun has caused. When Rick goes into Bird Person's mind to save him, we see memories of their friendship that show Rick has always been this way. Even as a young man, Rick was telling Bird Person that nothing matters because infinite realities exist. The memory version of young Rick is horrified when he meets old Rick. He realizes that his philosophy of nothing matters will eventually turn him into someone who abandons his dying friend rather than endure a little emotional pain. The portal gun didn't create Rick's nihilism, but it made it possible for him to live that way without consequences. In Bird Person's memories, Rick explains that he could take them to universes where they won the war, lost the war, or never fought at all equally real, all equally meaningless. This is the curse of infinite choice. When you can experience every possible outcome, no single outcome has any value. Young Rick asks old Rick why he helped in the war if nothing matters. Old Rick says, "Because I respect you, and I wanted you to know you could respect me." But then he immediately contradicts himself by saying the relationship doesn't matter to him. The portal gun has made Rick incapable of admitting he cares about anything because caring makes you vulnerable. The most disturbing part is when young Rick asks if he'll eventually become old Rick. Old Rick basically tells him yes, this is his future. The portal gun will slowly erode his ability to form genuine connections until he becomes a lonely, bitter old man who pushes away everyone who tries to love him. When Rick saves Bird Person from his suicidal thoughts, he has to confront the fact that he knew about Bird Person's daughter but chose not to tell him. The portal gun gave Rick the option to just find a different Bird Person who wasn't dealing with grief, so he didn't bother helping his actual friend process his trauma. Bird Person calls Rick out on this. He points out that Rick only revealed the daughter's existence when it was necessary to save himself. The portal gun has taught Rick to treat even his closest friends as replaceable, which destroys any possibility of real intimacy. The portal gun represents ultimate freedom, but it's the kind of freedom that makes life meaningless. When you can do anything, nothing feels worth doing. When you can go anywhere, nowhere feels like home. When you can replace anyone, no one feels irreplaceable. Rick's portal gun is basically a metaphor for how modern technology and endless options can make us less happy instead of more happy. When you have infinite choices on Netflix, you spend more time browsing than watching. When you have infinite dating options on apps, you spend more time swiping than connecting. When Rick has infinite realities to choose from, he spends more time escaping than living. The really twisted part is that Rick has become addicted to this lifestyle. In Rick-ternal Friendshine, when young Rick asks if he wants to do awesome stuff that matters, old Rick says no. The portal gun has conditioned him to prefer meaningless adventures over meaningful relationships because relationships require you to stay in one place and deal with problems. But the episodes also show us that Rick is capable of real love and sacrifice when the portal gun can't save him. When he's trapped and can't escape, he chooses to save his family by turning himself in. When Bird Person is dying and Rick can't just find a replacement, he risks his life to save his friend's mind. The portal gun has given Rick the power to avoid every difficult emotion and challenging situation. But avoiding difficulty is what prevents growth. Rick has infinite intelligence and infinite possibilities, but he's emotionally stunted because he never has to work through anything. The worst part is that Rick knows this. He understands that the portal gun has ruined him, but he's too addicted to the escape it provides. In the pilot, he drunkenly threatens to destroy Earth just to test Morty. In The Wedding Squanchers, he watches his best friend die because he can't commit to staying in one reality long enough to build proper defenses. The portal gun has made Rick the most powerful person in the multiverse and simultaneously the most powerless. He can go anywhere but belongs nowhere. He can do anything but nothing matters to him. He can replace everyone but connect with no one. Every time Rick pulls out that portal gun, he's choosing isolation over connection, escape over growth, and freedom over love. The green glow of the portal is showing us the light of every bridge Rick burns when he chooses to run instead of stay and fight for what matters. The portal gun is Rick's greatest invention and his greatest mistake. It gave him everything he thought he wanted and destroyed everything he actually needed. That's the real curse of infinite choice. Sometimes having every option means choosing nothing at all. And the saddest part is that Rick keeps using it anyway, because facing one reality is harder than escaping to infinite ones. The portal gun has made him the smartest man in the universe and the loneliest person alive. That's what ultimate power really costs, everything that makes life worth living. But there's an even deeper layer to this curse that most people miss. The portal gun has fundamentally broken Rick's relationship with time and consequences. In the pilot, when Rick is explaining the mega seeds to Morty, he casually mentions going to a future dimension to get leg healing serum. He spent so much time in that advanced dimension that his portal gun ran out of charge, but he talks about it like it was just a fun vacation. Think about what that means. Rick abandoned his family for who knows how long to party with younger women in a future dimension, and he treats it like a funny story. The portal gun lets him escape the normal flow of time and responsibility. When Jerry suggests putting Rick in a nursing home, Rick acts like the idea is ridiculous because he builds robots for fun. But the truth is, Rick's intelligence has become meaningless because the portal gun removes all stakes from his inventions. If he builds something that accidentally destroys Earth, He just hops to a reality where he didn't make that mistake. The Mega Seeds subplot shows how the portal gun has corrupted even Rick's relationship with Morty. Rick doesn't tell Morty that the seeds will make him temporarily smart and then cause brain damage. He just uses Morty as a smuggling device and deals with the consequences later. When Morty has a seizure from the seeds wearing off, Rick isn't concerned about permanent damage because he could always find a dimension with a Morty who didn't get brain damage. The most disturbing implication is in Rick's final monologue to the unconscious Morty. He talks about all the adventures they'll go on, but he also says, "The world is full of idiots that don't understand what's important and they'll tear us apart, Morty." The portal gun has taught Rick that the only relationship worth maintaining is with someone who depends on him completely. The Wedding Squanchers reveals how the portal gun has affected Rick's ability to plan for the future. When the Federation surrounds the wedding, Rick is completely unprepared. He's so used to being able to escape any situation that he never developed proper defensive strategies. Squanchy has to sacrifice himself to give them time to escape, and even then, Rick barely makes it out. The scene where Rick calls the Federation pretending to be Jerry is heartbreaking because it shows Rick finally accepting consequences. But even his sacrifice is tainted by the portal gun's influence. He can't just turn himself in with dignity. He has to make crude jokes because he's never learned how to process serious emotions without deflecting. When the family returns to Earth under Federation rule, Jerry is genuinely happy with their new life. He has a job, he's taking prescribed medication, and everything is structured for him. But Beth and the kids are miserable because they've seen what's possible with the portal gun. The device has ruined their ability to be satisfied with a normal life. The Federation's control over Earth is actually a mirror of what the portal gun does to Rick. Both remove the need to make difficult choices or face uncertainty. Jerry loves the Federation because it takes away his anxiety about the future, just like Rick loves the portal gun because it removes consequences from his actions. Rickternal Friendshine shows us the evolutionary process of how the portal gun corrupts Rick's psychology. Young Rick is idealistic and wants to fight for causes that matter. But when old Rick tells him about infinite realities where they won, lost, or never fought, it plants the seed of nihilism that will eventually consume him. The memory of Rick explaining infinite realities to Birdperson is crucial because it shows Rick actively spreading his portal gun philosophy. He's convincing his friends that nothing matters because other versions exist. This is how the portal gun becomes a psychological virus that infects everyone around Rick. When young Rick asks why old Rick helped in the war if nothing matters, old Rick's answer reveals the portal gun's true curse. He says, "Because I respect you, and I wanted you to know you could respect me." But then he immediately adds that the relationship isn't worth his integrity. The portal gun has taught Rick to value respect over love, because respect doesn't require commitment. The Battle of Blood Ridge memory shows Rick and Birdperson at their closest, fighting side by side and saving each other's lives. But even in this moment of genuine connection, Rick is already talking about how he could show Birdperson the same battle in different universes. He can't just experience the moment without contextualizing it within infinite possibilities. Birdperson's rejection of Rick's offer to travel the multiverse is the moment their friendship starts dying. Rick offers Birdperson everything he thinks is valuable infinite adventures, freedom from consequences, the power to see all possible outcomes. But Birdperson chooses to stay and continue fighting for his home reality, and Rick can't understand why anyone would choose meaning over freedom. The portal gun has created a fundamental incompatibility between Rick and everyone else. Normal people form attachments to specific places, people, and experiences. But Rick sees everything as interchangeable because he knows infinite versions exist. When Birdperson dies, Rick could theoretically find a dimension with a living Birdperson, but it wouldn't be the same person who shared those specific memories. When Rick goes into Birdperson's mind to save him, he's finally forced to confront what the portal gun has cost him. He sees memories of their friendship from Birdperson's perspective and realizes that his best friend saw him as someone who had already given up on genuine connection. The young Rick memory asking if he'll become old Rick is really asking if the portal gun will eventually destroy his capacity for love. The revelation about Birdperson's daughter shows how the portal gun has warped Rick's moral reasoning. Rick knew about the child, but didn't tell Birdperson because it was easier to just avoid the complication. The portal gun taught Rick that problems are meant to be escaped, not solved, so he applies this logic even to his closest relationships. Birdperson's accusation that Rick only revealed the daughter's existence to save himself cuts to the heart of the portal gun's corruption. Rick has become incapable of doing the right thing unless it also serves his immediate interests. The device that was supposed to give him infinite freedom has made him infinitely selfish. The most tragic aspect of the portal gun's curse is that it prevents Rick from learning from his mistakes. Every time he ruins a relationship or destroys a world, he can just portal to a reality where it didn't happen. This means he never develops the emotional skills needed to repair damage or prevent future problems. Normal people learn empathy and responsibility through consequences. When you hurt someone and can't escape, you have to figure out how to make amends. When you make a mistake and can't undo it, you have to learn better judgment. But the portal gun has removed these learning opportunities from Rick's life, leaving him emotionally stunted despite his vast intelligence. The portal gun represents the ultimate privilege, the ability to opt out of any situation that becomes uncomfortable. And like all privileges, it corrupts the person who wields it. Rick has become incapable of genuine relationships because he's never forced to work through difficult periods or make sacrifices for others. In the end, the portal gun is his greatest addiction. He keeps using it even though he knows it's destroying everything he claims to care about. because the alternative, staying in one reality and dealing with problems like a normal person, feels impossible after so many years of infinite escape routes. The green glow of the portal is the light of a prison that Rick built for himself, one portal at a time. Now let's break down every time Rick has shown he loves Morty. But don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Rick spends most of his time acting like Morty is just a human shield with legs. But if you actually watch what he does instead of listening to his mouth, you'll catch these little moments where he drops the whole "I don't care about anything" act. These episodes basically prove that Rick loves Morty way more than he'll ever say out loud. Look, Rick's whole thing is pretending he doesn't give a crap about anyone because caring makes you weak, right? But every time Morty gets in real trouble, Rick throws that philosophy right out the window. He'll risk everything for this kid he supposedly just keeps around to hide his brainwaves. Me Seeks and Destroy starts with Rick being his usual jerk self. Morty just had to kill what looked like his family, and he's literally puking in the corner. And Rick makes some dumb joke about tuna. Classic Rick move. But then Morty gets fed up and challenges Rick to let him run an adventure for once. Here's where it gets interesting. Rick could easily just say no or sabotage Morty from the start. But he doesn't. He actually gives Morty a real shot at leading. When they end up in that cheesy fantasy village with the giant in the clouds, Rick holds back from taking over, even when things start going sideways. Morty wants to play hero and climb the giant's castle, and Rick just goes along with it. Sure, he complains the whole time, but he's still there. He could portal them out any second, but he lets Morty have his moment. That's already pretty weird for Rick. But the real moment happens in that weird stair tavern. Rick is just sitting there playing cards, probably planning how he's gonna mock Morty's adventure later. Then Morty comes out of the bathroom looking completely messed up, and right after him comes Mr. Jellybean all beaten up and angry. Rick doesn't need anyone to spell it out for him. He takes one look at both of them and immediately knows what went down in that bathroom. And you know what he does? He doesn't interrogate Morty or make him explain what happened. He doesn't even bring it up. Instead, Rick suddenly gets all generous and suggests they use his gambling money to pay for a ride and give the rest to the villagers. This is Rick we're talking about, the guy who charges his own family for portal travel. But now he's playing Santa Claus because he knows Morty needs to feel like something good came out of this nightmare. When they portal home and Rick sees Mr. Jellybean getting carried around like some beloved king, he opens another portal just to blast that creep into pieces. Rick risks blowing his cover to a whole village just to make sure that thing can never hurt another kid. He doesn't even tell Morty he did it. That's love, dude. Violent, messed up Rick-style love. But love all the same. Rick saw someone hurt his grandson, and he made sure they could never do it again. No questions, no speeches, just action. Get Swifty shows Rick's protective side in a totally different way. When those giant heads show up wanting Earth to perform or die, Rick doesn't have to bring Morty along. There's no scientific reason the kid needs to be at the Pentagon or Area 51. Rick could handle this alone. But he brings Morty anyway because when the world might be ending, Rick wants to keep his grandson close. Think about it. If Rick really saw Morty as just some disposable sidekick, he'd stash him somewhere safe and deal with the crisis solo. Instead, he drags Morty along to what could be humanity's last performance. When Morty gets pissed off and steals the portal gun to find his family, Rick totally panics. Because Morty is lost somewhere in the multiverse and Rick can't protect him. Rick actually tries to grab Morty before he jumps through that portal, which is not something you do for someone you don't care about. The whole time Morty is gone, Rick is struggling. His song sucks, he's clearly distracted, and even Ice-T can tell something's wrong. But the second Morty shows up during their performance, everything clicks. The Cromulans literally start cheering just because Morty appeared on stage. Rick could have easily taken all the credit for saving Earth. He's got the ego for it. But instead, he makes sure Morty gets recognized too. When they're celebrating, Rick includes Morty in everything like they're actual partners instead of just grandfather and sidekick. The Vat of Acid episode is probably the most twisted example of Rick showing love, but it's also the clearest one. When Morty calls the acid vat idea stupid and challenges Rick's intelligence, Rick could have just ignored him or made fun of him. Instead, he spends however long creating this insanely complex reality-splitting device just because Morty wanted it. Rick claims he doesn't do time travel because it's beneath him, but he basically creates something way more complicated just to give Morty his save point thing. Rick will bend his own rules if it makes Morty happy, even when he's also trying to teach him a lesson. But here's the thing nobody talks about. When Morty starts using the device and turns into this reckless person who doesn't care about consequences, Rick gets genuinely disturbed. He's not just annoyed that his lesson backfired, he's actually worried about what Morty is becoming. Rick watches Morty turn into someone cruel and careless, and you can see it bothers him. This is a guy who claims nothing matters, but watching his grandson lose his humanity clearly affects him. Rick starts questioning his own philosophy because he doesn't like what he sees when Morty adopts it. When Rick finally reveals that Morty has been killing alternate versions of himself every time he reset, he's not gloating about being right. He seems genuinely sad about it. Rick tells Morty about living without consequences and asks, "What am I living for?" He's basically admitting that watching Morty become heartless made him question his own choices. The most telling part comes at the end when that whole mob is after Morty. Rick could portal them away or blast everyone with some sci-fi weapon. Instead, he uses the acid vat to save Morty. The exact same idea he spent the entire episode mocking. Rick saves his grandson using Morty's original plan, which is basically Rick's way of saying, "You were right and I was wrong." For Rick, that might as well be a love confession written in skywriting. What makes all this even more heartbreaking is that Rick never explains himself. He doesn't give emotional speeches or talk about his feelings. He just acts, then pretends like it was no big deal. Rick's love language is protection and validation, but he delivers it in the most roundabout way possible. Think about how Rick treats everyone else versus how he treats Morty. Jerry gets constant insults and put-downs. Beth gets manipulation and emotional distance. Summer gets ignored half the time, but Morty gets Rick's attention, protection, and weird twisted lessons that are supposed to help him survive. Rick's cruelty toward Morty usually comes from a place of care he can't express properly. When he's mean to Morty, he's trying to prepare him for a universe that will be even worse. When he puts Morty in dangerous situations, it's because he believes Morty can handle them and needs to learn how. The whole relationship is tragic because Rick's love is real, but it's completely damaged by his own issues. Rick knows that caring about people causes pain, so he tries to make Morty emotionally tough by being harsh to him first. It's messed up logic, but it comes from wanting to protect Morty from getting hurt by the universe. Rick sees Morty as the one genuinely good thing in his life, which is why he's so desperate to keep him around and so angry when Morty challenges him. Rick's whole sense of self-worth is tied up in being the smartest guy around, but Morty makes him want to be better than just smart. Morty makes Rick want to be worthy of love, even though Rick has no clue how to handle that. Here's the really messed up part. Rick's love often looks like control and manipulation because he thinks he knows what's best for Morty. Rick will hurt Morty if he thinks it'll make him stronger later. That's not healthy love, but it's still love. Rick would rather be the bad guy in Morty's story than let the universe be even worse to him. But those moments when Rick drops the act completely shooting Mr. Jellybean, panicking when Morty disappears, using the acid vat idea, those show us who Rick really is under all that damage. He's just a grandfather who loves his grandson more than anything but has no idea how to show it without screwing it up. Rick might be the smartest person in the universe, but when it comes to emotions, he's completely lost. All he knows is protect and provide, even when his methods are questionable. These episodes prove that Rick would burn down entire realities to keep Morty safe. He just can't say, "I love you," like a normal person. The saddest part is, Morty probably doesn't realize how much Rick cares because Rick is so bad at showing it in healthy ways. But if you watch what Rick does instead of listening to what he says, the love is obvious. Rick just doesn't know how to care about someone without destroying himself in the process. Every time Rick risks his life, his reputation, or his ego for Morty, he's basically screaming, "I love you," in the only language he knows. Too bad Morty doesn't speak that language yet. There's another layer to this whole thing that makes it even more complicated. Rick's love for Morty is probably the most selfish and unselfish thing about him at the same time. On one hand, Rick genuinely wants to protect Morty and help him grow stronger. On the other hand, Rick also needs Morty around because Morty is the only person who makes Rick feel like he matters. Think about Rick's life before Morty started going on adventures with him. Rick was this bitter old man living in the garage, building random inventions that nobody cared about. His daughter barely tolerated him, his son-in-law hated him, and Summer treated him like furniture. Then Morty starts coming along on these crazy trips, and suddenly Rick has someone who depends on him. Morty makes Rick feel important again. When Morty gets scared, he looks to Rick for protection. When they're in trouble, Morty trusts Rick to get them out. When the world is ending, Morty believes Rick can save it. For someone who spent years feeling useless and unwanted, having Morty's faith means everything. But here's where it gets weird. Rick's need to be needed by Morty sometimes conflicts with his desire to protect Morty. Rick will put Morty in dangerous situations, partly because dangerous situations are where Rick gets to shine as the hero. Rick creates problems so he can solve them and prove his worth to Morty. The acid vat episode is a perfect example of this. Rick didn't have to create that elaborate reality-splitting device. He could have just admitted the acid vat was a decent backup plan and moved on. But Rick's ego couldn't handle Morty thinking he wasn't smart enough to make it work. So Rick created this incredibly complex solution to prove he could do anything Morty imagined. The twisted part is that Rick's demonstration ended up hurting Morty way more than just admitting the vat was okay would have. Rick's need to prove himself to Morty literally caused Morty to become a mass murderer of alternate selves. Rick's love for Morty and his need for Morty's admiration created the exact opposite of what he wanted. You can see this pattern in other episodes too. Rick will take Morty on adventures that are way more dangerous than they need to be, because Rick wants to impress him. Rick wants Morty to see him as this amazing scientist who can handle anything. But those same adventures traumatize Morty and make him question whether Rick actually cares about his safety. There's also the question of whether Rick's protection of Morty is really about Morty or about Rick's own guilt and trauma. Rick has lost people before. We know he had a different version of his family that got killed, and he's probably lost friends and partners across multiple dimensions. Maybe Rick's desperate need to protect Morty comes from his terror of losing someone else he cares about. When Rick shoots Mr. Jellybean, he's not just protecting Morty from that specific threat. He's protecting Morty from the kind of universe Rick knows exists, where bad things happen to good people for no reason. Rick can't fix the whole universe, but he can make sure that particular monster never hurts anyone again. The same thing happens when Rick panics about Morty being lost in the multiverse during the Cromalon crisis. Rick has seen what's out there in other dimensions. He knows there are infinite versions of reality where terrible things happen to infinite versions of Morty. The idea of his Morty being stuck in one of those realities probably terrifies Rick more than anything else. Rick's love for Morty is also tied up with his own self-hatred. Rick thinks he's a terrible person who ruins everything he touches. So, when he starts caring about Morty, Rick becomes convinced that being around him will eventually destroy Morty too. That's why Rick is constantly testing Morty and putting him through harsh experiences. Rick is trying to make Morty strong enough to survive being loved by Rick. This creates this horrible cycle where Rick hurts Morty to protect him from the pain Rick thinks he'll inevitably cause. Rick believes that if he doesn't toughen Morty up now, Rick will accidentally destroy him later. It's like Rick is trying to inoculate Morty against Rick's own toxicity by giving him small doses of it. The really messed up thing is that Rick's approach kind of works, but not in the way he intended. Morty does become stronger and more capable over time. He learns to stand up to Rick, make his own decisions, and survive in dangerous situations. But he also becomes more cynical, more willing to use violence, and less trusting of other people. Rick is accidentally creating a version of Morty who can survive in Rick's universe, but who might not be able to live happily in the normal world anymore. Morty is becoming more like Rick, which is probably the last thing Rick actually wants, but the only outcome his methods could produce. And here's the thing that really gets to me about their relationship. Despite all the dysfunction and manipulation and trauma, there are these moments of genuine connection between them. When they're performing Get Schwifty together, they're actually having fun. When Rick uses the acid vat to save Morty, there's this look of understanding between them. Now, when they work together to solve problems, they're genuinely good partners. Rick and Morty both know their relationship is messed up, but they also know they need each other. Rick needs someone who still believes he can be a hero, and Morty needs someone who makes him feel special and important. They're both getting something vital from this relationship, even though it's also slowly destroying them. Maybe that's what love looks like when you're damaged enough. You hurt the person you care about because you don't know any other way to connect. You push them away while desperately trying to pull them closer. You try to prepare them for a cruel world by being cruel to them first. Rick's love for Morty is real. And in a universe as chaotic and meaningless as the one they live in, maybe having someone who would burn down reality to protect you is worth all the therapy you'll need later. Now let's talk about the mystery of Doofus Rick. Doofus Rick might actually be the smartest Rick in the entire multiverse, and the other Ricks hate him because he figured out something they're all too damaged to understand. While every other Rick is obsessed with being the most intelligent person in the room, Doofus Rick discovered that intelligence without kindness is basically worthless. The Council of Ricks treats Doofus Rick like he's some kind of embarrassment to their whole species. They call him the worst Rick of all, make jokes about him eating poop, and constantly exclude him from their activities. But here's the thing that's really weird about their reaction. If Doofus Rick was actually just stupid, why would they care so much about him? Think about it. The other Ricks encounter all kinds of idiots across the multiverse every day. Jerry exists in most of their dimensions, and they barely acknowledge him most of the time. But Doofus Rick gets under their skin in a way that suggests he's threatening something fundamental about their worldview. When Doofus Rick shows up at the Smith house, he immediately does something no other Rick would ever do. He asks Jerry about his job, and then acts genuinely interested in the answer. Not sarcastic interest, not condescending interest, but real curiosity about what Jerry does for a living. That's completely alien behavior for a Rick. The other Ricks are so disturbed by this that they can't help but interfere. They tell Jerry that Doofus Rick eats poop, which is probably just a lie they made up because they can't stand watching him be nice to someone. The idea of a Rick showing genuine respect to Jerry is so offensive to them that they have to sabotage it. But Jerry sees right through their garbage. When Doofus Rick starts talking about advertising like it's this noble profession where you help people figure out what to buy, Jerry initially thinks he's being sarcastic. Every other Rick in his life has mocked his career choices, but Doofus Rick means every word he says. The bond they form is pretty incredible when you really think about it. Here's Jerry, who spends his entire life being told he's worthless by his own father-in-law, suddenly meeting a version of that same person who thinks he's amazing. And Doofus Rick gets to experience what it's like to have someone appreciate him for who he is, instead of constantly comparing him to other versions of himself. When they're in the garage making those ovenless brownies together, Doofus Rick is using his scientific genius to make Jerry happy. Every other Rick uses their intelligence to prove how much smarter they are than everyone else. Doofus Rick uses his to improve someone else's day. That's a completely different approach to being a genius. The scene with Jerry's coin collection is where you really see what makes Doofus Rick special. Jerry shows him these R2-D2 coins that everyone makes fun of him for buying, and Doofus Rick doesn't dismiss them or mock Jerry's choice. Instead, he tells Jerry that the coins have value because Jerry likes them, and that's what matters. That might sound simple, but it's actually a pretty profound philosophy. Doofus Rick understands that value doesn't come from external validation or objective measurements. Things matter because people care about them, not because they meet some universal standard of importance. Every other Rick would have used that moment to prove their intellectual superiority. They would have explained why the coins are a bad investment or made fun of Jerry for being sentimental about Star Wars merchandise. Doofus Rick validates Jerry's choice and helps him feel good about something that brings him joy. The really heartbreaking part comes when Jerry asks how long Doofus Rick is staying, and Doofus Rick says until they find his Rick. Jerry immediately responds that he already found his Rick, meaning Doofus Rick. In that moment, Jerry realizes he's been living with the wrong version of his father-in-law this whole time. When the other Ricks come to take Doofus Rick away, Jerry actually suggests getting rid of regular Rick and keeping Doofus Rick instead. Jerry, who usually goes along with whatever everyone else wants, is ready to commit murder to keep the one Rick who treats him with respect. Doofus Rick has to be the mature one in that situation. He tells Jerry it wouldn't work and that they both need to return to their regular lives. But the fact that Jerry was willing to fight for their friendship shows how much it meant to both of them. The other Rick's hatred of Doofus Rick becomes even more obvious when they mock Jerry for hanging out with Doofus Rick like it's the most pathetic thing imaginable. They can't understand why anyone would choose to spend time with him, which says way more about their own emotional limitations than it does about Doofus Rick's worth. Here's what I think is really going on with Doofus Rick. He represents what Rick could be if he wasn't completely consumed by his own trauma and ego. All Ricks have the same basic intelligence, but most of them use it as a weapon to hurt people or a shield to keep people away. Doofus Rick uses his intelligence to connect with others and make their lives better. The other Ricks call him the worst Rick because he violates their fundamental belief system. They've all decided that caring about people makes you weak and that intelligence gives you the right to look down on everyone else. Doofus Rick proves them wrong just by existing. Maybe Doofus Rick comes from a dimension where his family didn't get killed, so he never developed all that trauma and bitterness that drives the other Ricks. Or maybe he went through the same pain, but chose to respond differently. Either way, he shows that being a Rick doesn't automatically mean being a sociopath. The fact that Doofus Rick never had kids of his own but still ended up caring for Eric Stoltz's mask Morty also says something important about his character. He took responsibility for a Morty that nobody else wanted because he understands that love isn't about genetic connection or personal benefit. When Jerry punches the wall after Doofus Rick leaves, he's not just sad about losing a friend. He's grieving for the relationship he could have had with his actual father-in-law if Rick wasn't so damaged. Doofus Rick showed Jerry what it would feel like to be respected and valued by someone that brilliant, and now he has to go back to being treated like garbage. The mystery of Doofus Rick is why the other Ricks are so threatened by his approach that they have to constantly put him down and exclude him from their group. I think it's because Doofus Rick represents a path they all chose not to take. Every time they see him being kind and genuine, they're reminded of who they could have been if they hadn't let their trauma turn them into monsters. Doofus Rick is living proof that intelligence and compassion can coexist, which makes their own cruelty look like a choice rather than an inevitability. The saddest part is that the council probably has dozens of Doofus Ricks from different dimensions, and they probably treat them all the same way. There could be entire realities full of kind, brilliant Ricks who use their gifts to help people, but the council only values the ones who are as broken and bitter as they are. Doofus Rick threatens their entire worldview because he's achieved something they all claim is impossible. He's genuinely happy. He's not drinking himself into oblivion or constantly running from his problems or hurting the people around him. He figured out how to be a genius without being miserable, which is apparently the one thing other Ricks can't handle. Maybe calling him Doofus Rick is their way of protecting themselves from having to admit they've been doing everything wrong. If they acknowledge that his approach actually works better than theirs, they'd have to face the fact that they've been choosing to be terrible people this whole time. In the end, Doofus Rick represents hope. He proves that trauma doesn't have to define you and that intelligence can be a gift rather than a curse. The other Ricks hate him for it, but Jerry loves him for it. And honestly, that tells you everything you need to know about who's actually got their priorities straight. Now let's compare Beth and Space Beth and find out who's the real clone. Remember to subscribe to our channel. Rick pulled off the ultimate mind game by erasing his own memory of which Beth is real and which one is the clone. This might be the smartest and most twisted thing Rick has ever done, because it forces everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth that identity might not be as solid as we think it is. The whole thing starts in The ABCs of Beth, when Beth finds out about Fruipyland and realizes her childhood friend Tommy survived there by basically becoming a cannibal god king. But the real revelation comes when Beth starts questioning whether Rick was a good father for locking her in that place as a kid. Rick responds to Beth's criticism the way he always does, by giving her exactly what she thinks she wants. Beth feels trapped by her family and wonders what her life would have been like if she'd followed her dreams of becoming a space adventurer. So Rick offers to make her a clone that can stay home with the family while she goes off to have adventures. The genius of Rick's setup is that it creates this perfect psychological trap. Beth has always felt like she sacrificed her potential to be a mother and wife. She's spent years resenting Jerry and wondering what could have been. Rick offers her a way to have both lives simultaneously, but the catch is that only one version gets to feel like the real Beth. When we see Beth in Fruipyland, she's already showing signs of the kind of person who could abandon her family for adventure. She gets excited about the violence and chaos, she dismisses Rick's safety measures, and she shows genuine enthusiasm for the dangerous creatures they encounter. This is someone who's been suppressing her darker impulses for years. The moment Beth sees Tommy's kingdom, she's both horrified and fascinated. She's looking at a version of herself that chose power over responsibility, violence over restraint, and self-interest over family. It's everything she's ever fantasized about during her worst moments with Jerry and the kids. Rick's offer to clone her comes right after this revelation. He's essentially saying, "You want to be like Tommy? Fine, but I'll give you a way to do it without destroying your family." It's Rick at his most manipulative and most caring simultaneously. By the time we get to Star Mort Rick Turn of the Jerry, Space Beth has become everything regular Beth fantasized about being. She's a legendary rebel leader, she's confident and dangerous, she's living a life of constant adventure and excitement. But she's also isolated, paranoid, and haunted by the possibility that she's not real. The bomb in Space Beth's neck is the perfect symbol of Rick's twisted love. He claims it's just a tracker, but Space Beth is convinced it's designed to kill her if she gets too close to her original life. Whether Rick is lying or telling the truth doesn't matter. The bomb represents the barrier between the two lives Beth could have lived. When Space Beth returns to Earth, she's not just looking for answers about the bomb. She's looking for validation that her choice was the right one. She wants to prove that she's the real Beth by showing how much more accomplished and interesting she's become compared to her domestic counterpart. But regular Beth has her own accomplishments to defend. She's raised 2 children, maintained a marriage, built a career, and kept a family together through multiple crises. She's chosen stability and responsibility over adventure, and she needs to believe that choice was valuable and authentic. The confrontation between the two Beths is really an argument between 2 different life philosophies. Space Beth represents the belief that authentic living requires pursuing your dreams regardless of the cost to others. Regular Beth represents the belief that authentic living means accepting responsibility for the people who depend on you. Both Beths are convinced that the other one made the wrong choice. Space Beth sees regular Beth as someone who gave up and settled for mediocrity. Regular Beth sees Space Beth as someone who abandoned her family for selfish thrills. They're both partially right and completely wrong. The psychological warfare between them reveals how much they both doubt their own choices. Space Beth keeps emphasizing how exciting and important her rebellion work is, but she also admits she came back to kill Rick, which suggests she's not as satisfied with her new life as she pretends. Rick's memory erasure becomes the ultimate trump card in this psychological battle. By admitting he doesn't know which one is the clone, he's essentially telling both Beths that their fears might be justified. Either one of them could be the fake, which means either one of them could be living a lie. But Rick's amnesia also reveals something important about his relationship with both daughters. If he truly didn't care which one was real, he wouldn't have bothered erasing his memory. The fact that he went to such lengths to forget suggests that he knew the knowledge would be too painful or too tempting to use against one of them. Rick's decision to forget is also a rare moment of genuine fairness from someone who usually plays favorites. By not knowing which Beth is which, he's forced to treat them both as equally legitimate. He can't use the clone status as a weapon in arguments or as an excuse to care less about one of them. When both Beths refuse to look at the memory, they're making the most mature decision either of them has ever made. They're choosing to define themselves by their actions and choices rather than by their origin story. They're rejecting Rick's framework entirely and deciding that the question itself is irrelevant. This rejection is also a form of rebellion against Rick's control. By refusing to care about the answer, they're telling him that his elaborate mind game doesn't matter to them anymore. They've moved beyond needing his validation or his categories of real and fake. The clone mystery also functions as a metaphor for the broader question of whether anyone is really authentic. How much of our personality comes from our genetics, our upbringing, our choices, or our circumstances? If you could change any of those factors, would you still be the same person? Both Beths have been shaped by their experiences since the split. Space Beth has become more confident and ruthless through her adventures. Regular Beth has become more patient and nurturing through raising her children. They've grown in different directions, which means they're not even the same person anymore, regardless of which one started as the clone. The philosophical implications get even weirder when you consider that Rick himself has been replaced multiple times. The Rick in these episodes might not be the same Rick who created the original clone. If Rick can be swapped out and still be considered continuous, then the distinction between original and copy becomes completely meaningless. Rick's casual attitude toward his own replaceability suggests that he's already resolved this question for himself. He doesn't worry about whether he's the original Rick because he knows that his identity comes from his memories and personality, not from some metaphysical essence that can't be copied. The bomb subplot adds another layer of manipulation to the whole situation. Whether it's a tracker or a weapon, it serves the same psychological function. It makes Space Beth feel like she's living on borrowed time. This urgency drives her back to Earth and forces the confrontation that Rick probably wanted all along. Jerry's role in the whole situation is particularly pathetic. When he asks which Beth is his, both Beths immediately shut him down. He's so focused on ownership and possession that he can't see that both women have grown beyond being defined by their relationship to him. Summer and Morty's reaction to having 2 mothers is much healthier. They immediately embrace the situation and see it as a benefit rather than a problem. They don't care which one is the original because they're getting twice as much parental attention and support. The kids' attitude toward the clone mystery shows how artificial the whole dilemma really is. They love both versions of their mother and don't see any reason to choose between them. Their acceptance highlights how much the adults are overthinking the situation. When Rick finally admits he's a terrible father, it's one of the few moments of genuine self-awareness we get from him. He understands that his manipulation and control have caused most of the family's problems, but he still can't resist pulling strings and creating elaborate scenarios. The ending where Rick keeps the memory device but doesn't use it is perfect ambiguous Rick behavior. He might genuinely be committed to treating both Beths equally, or he might be saving the information for future manipulation. With Rick, noble gestures and selfish scheming often look identical. The fact that both Beths end up working together against the Galactic Federation suggests that the clone question really is irrelevant. They can function as partners and allies without needing to resolve their origin story. Their cooperation proves that they're both capable of growth and change. Both Beths represent different aspects of Rick's personality. Space Beth embodies his adventurous, rebellious side that values freedom above all else. Regular Beth embodies his protective, nurturing side that actually cares about maintaining relationships with the people he loves. By creating two versions of his daughter, Rick is essentially splitting himself in half and seeing which version he prefers. The fact that he erases his memory of which is which suggests that he couldn't choose between these two aspects of himself either. Rick's memory erasure might be the most honest thing he's ever done because it acknowledges that both choices are equally valid. By refusing to judge which Beth made the right decision, he's admitting that there might not be a right decision in this situation. The clone mystery will probably never be definitively resolved, and that's the point. Both Beths have moved on from caring about it. They're both living their lives, making their own choices, and being their own people. The origin story has become irrelevant because the present reality is all that matters. Now we'll cover every type of Jerry across the multiverse. Jerry Smith is the multiverse's designated punching bag, and these episodes prove that no matter what reality you visit, Jerry will always find a way to be the most pathetic person in the room. Even when the universe gives him everything he could possibly want, he still manages to be Jerry about it. The Rickshank Redemption shows us Jerry at his absolute peak, and it's still depressing as hell. The Galactic Federation has taken over Earth, and somehow this is the best thing that's ever happened to Jerry's life. He's getting promoted every week at a job he doesn't understand, making a six-figure income in pills, and finally feeling successful for the first time in his existence. But here's the thing that makes Jerry so perfectly. Jerry, he has no idea what he actually does for work. He just shows up somewhere, does nothing, and gets rewarded for it. The Federation basically created the perfect job for someone with zero skills or ambition. They're paying him to exist, which is honestly the only job Jerry is qualified for. Jerry is so excited about his meaningless promotions that he doesn't care about the fact that his entire planet has been enslaved by alien bugs. His family is miserable, human civilization has ended, and Jerry is just happy that someone finally thinks he's worth something. It's the most Jerry response possible to the apocalypse. When Summer starts talking about rescuing Rick, Jerry immediately gets defensive about his new lifestyle. He doesn't want Rick to come back because Rick's return would mean Jerry goes back to being the family loser instead of the Federation's favorite pet human. Jerry would rather live under alien occupation than deal with Rick making fun of him. The scene where Jerry is bragging about his success while his family eats pills for dinner perfectly captures everything wrong with Jerry's priorities. He's so desperate for validation that he'll take it from literal space Nazis as long as they make him feel important. Jerry doesn't care about freedom or dignity. He just wants someone to tell him he's doing a good job. But then Rick destroys the Galactic Federation by changing one number in their economic system, and Jerry's perfect little fantasy world collapses instantly. All his promotions and achievements disappear because they were never real to begin with. Jerry was just a pet that the aliens kept around for entertainment. The really sad part is that Jerry doesn't learn anything from this experience. He doesn't realize that his success was meaningless or that he was being used. He just goes back to being regular Jerry, but now with the added trauma of knowing what it feels like to think you matter. The Rick, Chury, and Morty date gives us a completely different Jerry situation, but somehow he's still the same loser. In this episode, Jerry actually wins Beth back by being genuine and honest about their relationship. He helps her figure out whether she's a clone by reminding her of a specific memory they shared, and it's actually kind of sweet. But even Jerry's moment of triumph is undercut by the fact that it only works because Beth might be a clone who was programmed to love him. Jerry doesn't win Beth back through personal growth or by becoming a better person. He wins her back because Rick may have literally designed a version of Beth that would find Jerry tolerable. The memory Jerry uses to prove Beth is real is about a date where he was too nervous to hold her hand because his palms were sweaty. It's such a Jerry story. He was so anxious about a simple romantic gesture that he ended up making it weird and awkward. But Beth finds this endearing, which suggests she really might be the clone. Jerry's relationship with Beth throughout these episodes shows how he functions as the multiverse's designated failure. In the Rickshank Redemption, Beth is ready to divorce him the second Rick comes back. In the Rick, Chury, and Morty date, she only stays with him after Rick basically gives his blessing. Jerry can never win Beth on his own merits. He only gets her when external circumstances make him the least bad option. The President-Jerry dynamic in these episodes is fascinating because it shows how Jerry reacts when he encounters someone who's actually competent. Jerry immediately gets intimidated by the president's authority and starts trying to suck up to him. Even when the president is clearly in the wrong, Jerry can't stand up to him because Jerry has no backbone. When Rick and the president are fighting over a selfie, Jerry just stands there being useless. He can't mediate the conflict or provide any meaningful input because Jerry has never had an original thought in his life. He's just a bystander watching more important people fight about things he doesn't understand. The fact that Jerry ends up back with Beth at the end of the Rick, Chury, and Morty date feels like the universe playing a cruel joke on everyone involved. Jerry didn't earn Beth back through character development or by proving he deserved another chance. He got her back because she was having an identity crisis and needed someone familiar to anchor her to reality. Jerry's role as the cosmic loser is so consistent across realities that it almost seems intentional. In the Cronenberg world, Jerry becomes a badass survivor, but that's only because Rick abandoned that dimension. Jerry can only succeed when Rick isn't around to make him look pathetic by comparison. The multiverse seems to have infinite variations of Rick and Morty, but Jerry is always basically the same: unemployed, insecure, needy, and completely dependent on other people for validation. Even when circumstances change dramatically, Jerry's fundamental Jerry-ness remains constant. Jerry's desperate need for approval makes him the perfect target for manipulation. The Galactic Federation used him by giving him meaningless jobs and fake achievements. Rick uses him by threatening him into compliance. Beth uses him as an emotional security blanket. Everyone sees Jerry as a tool rather than a person. But here's the really messed up part. Jerry is happy to be used as long as it makes him feel important. He doesn't want respect or genuine love. He just wants someone to pat him on the head and tell him he's doing okay. Jerry has such low self-esteem that he'll accept any form of attention, even if it's obviously fake. The episodes show how Jerry's incompetence creates problems for everyone around him. When Rick is in prison, Jerry's contentment with Federation rule makes it harder for the family to resist. When Rick is fighting the president, Jerry's inability to take a stand makes the conflict worse. Jerry actively makes things worse by being himself. Jerry represents everything Rick hates about conventional society: the desire for security over adventure, validation over truth, comfort over growth. Jerry is the embodiment of mediocrity, and his existence reminds Rick that most people are content to be ordinary. The tragedy of Jerry is that he's probably happier than anyone else in his family, but only because his expectations are so low. Jerry doesn't need to be the smartest person in the universe or go on incredible adventures. He just wants to feel like he belongs somewhere, which is actually kind of reasonable. But the show treats Jerry's modest desires as pathetic because they represent settling for less than what's possible. Jerry could theoretically improve himself and become more capable, but he chooses to stay in his comfort zone and rely on others. From Rick's perspective, Jerry's willingness to accept mediocrity is almost morally offensive. The multiverse contains infinite possibilities, but Jerry manages to be disappointing in every single one. That's almost an achievement in itself, being so consistently pathetic that even infinite variation can't produce a version of Jerry worth respecting. Jerry's story across these episodes is about the absurdity of finding meaning in meaningless systems. The Galactic Federation, human government, marriage, family, they're all just structures that people use to feel important. Jerry is the ultimate system-dependent person, which makes him both pitiable and contemptible. In the end, Jerry gets what he wants. Beth chooses him over Rick, the family stays together, and he gets to feel like the man of the house. But these victories feel hollow, because we know Jerry didn't earn them through personal growth or heroic actions. He won by default, which is the most Jerry way to win anything. The cosmic joke is that Jerry's role as the multiverse's loser is actually essential to everyone else's story. Rick needs Jerry to feel superior to someone. Beth needs Jerry to feel needed. The kids need Jerry to have a cautionary example of what not to become. Jerry's failure makes everyone else's success more meaningful. Maybe that's Jerry's true purpose in the multiverse: not to succeed, but to fail so spectacularly that it makes everyone else appreciate their own lives. Jerry is the cosmic control group, the baseline of mediocrity that makes everyone else's achievements feel significant. And honestly, that might be the most important job of all. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed our content, subscribe to our channel for more. You know how Rick always says time travel is too dangerous and refuses to do it? A Wrinkle in Time shows us exactly why he's so scared of it. This episode is basically Rick learning the hard way that some things are just too risky, even for someone as smart as him. So here's how the whole mess started. Rick decided to freeze time for 6 months just so they could clean up after a party without dealing with Jerry and Beth being mad about the trashed house. I mean, that's such a Rick move, using world-ending technology just to avoid an awkward conversation with his family. For half a year, Rick, Morty, and Summer have been chilling in frozen time, cleaning up and basically treating Jerry and Beth like living furniture. They've been vacuuming around them and everything. It's pretty messed up when you think about it, but also kind of hilarious in that dark Rick and Morty way. When Rick finally unfreezes time, he gives them this warning about how their personal time needs to stabilize first. He tells them not to touch Jerry or Beth, or they'll shatter into countless theoretical shards. Right there, Rick's basically admitting that even he can't fully control this stuff. That should have been everyone's first clue that maybe this wasn't such a great idea. Things start going wrong when Summer and Morty get into an argument about who was responsible for Mr. Benson falling off the roof. Their uncertainty about what actually happened creates what Rick calls a feedback loop of uncertainty that literally breaks reality in half. Suddenly, there are two versions of each of them just standing there. Rick realizes immediately how bad this is. He explains that they're not even in a timeline anymore. They're stuck in some weird space between realities with floating cats and impossible physics everywhere. They broke time so badly that they're existing in pure possibility where nothing is certain anymore. The floating Schrodinger's cats are actually a perfect touch. These cats exist in quantum superposition, both alive and dead at the same time until someone observes them. Rick, Morty, and Summer have basically become like those cats, trapped between different states because their argument broke the fundamental rules of reality. Rick tries to fix everything with a time crystal, but the kids keep arguing and making things worse. Every time they disagree about something or express uncertainty, reality splits again. Pretty soon, there are 4 versions of them, then 8, then more, all existing in these fractured timelines at the same time. Everything goes completely off the rails when the different Ricks start trying to kill each other. Each Rick assumes the other versions are going to betray him, so he tries to eliminate them first. This just creates more timeline fractures because now even Rick is uncertain about his own actions and motivations. When all the Ricks are fighting and everyone's panicking, Morty actually knocks out Rick with a fire extinguisher. It's one of those rare moments where Morty takes charge, but it also shows how Rick's own trust issues and paranoia made the whole situation way worse than it needed to be. Then this 4th-dimensional testicle monster shows up to help them out. He's from a higher dimension where time works differently, and even he's shocked by how badly they screwed things up. He tells them they broke time twice, which apparently makes their problem exponentially worse. The testicle monster gives them these collars that should sync their timelines back together, but Rick immediately starts questioning whether this guy is trying to trick them. Rick can't trust anyone, even someone who's genuinely trying to help, because his default setting is assuming everyone's out to get him. When the testicle monster mentions that the time crystal was stolen and he's taking them to time prison, Rick decides he'd rather fight his way out than face the consequences. Instead of trying to negotiate or cooperate, Rick goes straight to his usual solution: violence and chaos. Rick tricks the testicle monster and steals his weapon, but the weapon turns out to be a living creature that immediately runs into the street and gets hit by a car. So now they've accidentally killed Chris, the gun creature, and the testicle monster is even more upset with them. In desperation, Rick tells Summer and Morty to take off their time-stabilizing collars. He's literally choosing to make the time fracture problem worse rather than go to prison. Rick would rather risk destroying all of reality than face the consequences of his actions, which really says something about his character. With the collars off, reality starts splitting again, but this time Rick does it on purpose. He becomes deliberately uncertain about everything, causing time to fracture into dozens of different timelines. This creates enough chaos for them to overwhelm the testicle monster, but it also makes the fundamental problem much worse. By the end, there are 64 different timelines all splitting and merging in complete chaos. Most of the Ricks and Mortys are dying or just disappearing as reality falls apart around them. Only one timeline survives when Rick 30 manages to fix Morty's collar and stabilize their existence. The episode ends with Rick admitting that one version of himself had to sacrifice his life to save Morty. Rick 30 watched 63 other versions of himself die or disappear, and he knows their survival was basically just luck. That's gotta be pretty traumatic, even for someone as emotionally detached as Rick. The really crazy part is that Rick almost lost everything: his family, himself, possibly all of reality, just because he didn't want to clean up after a party and deal with Jerry being annoying about it. He risked literally everything to avoid a conversation about house damage. This episode explains why Rick consistently refuses to do time travel in other situations. He's seen firsthand how easily time stuff can spiral completely out of control and threaten everything he actually cares about. Even with Rick's incredible intelligence, time travel just has too many variables he can't control. The experience also shows Rick how his own psychological issues make time problems way worse. His paranoia, his inability to trust people, and his habit of choosing violence over cooperation all contributed to turning what should have been a technical problem into an existential crisis. After a wrinkle in time, Rick becomes much more careful about anything involving time. He'll happily use portal guns to hop between dimensions, but he consistently avoids messing with time itself. This episode taught him that some technologies are just too dangerous, even for him. The episode also shows why Rick usually prefers working alone or just with Morty. Having multiple people involved in dangerous science increases the chance of disagreement and uncertainty, which can be catastrophic when time manipulation is involved. Rick learned that collaboration makes time travel exponentially riskier. The fact that Rick needed help from a higher dimensional being to fix the problem shows that time manipulation is beyond even his capabilities. Rick is used to being the smartest person around, but time travel puts him in situations where his intelligence alone isn't enough to guarantee success. The testicle monster's casual mention of time prison suggests that time travel violations are taken seriously by interdimensional authorities. This implies beings much more advanced than him consider time manipulation dangerous. Rick's traumatic experience with timeline fractures also explains his general reluctance to let other people use his technology. He knows that even small mistakes can have massive consequences, and time-related mistakes are the absolute worst. Rick learned that some kinds of science are too dangerous to share with anyone. The episode shows that Rick's fear of time travel is genuine fear, based on actually experiencing how close he came to losing everything. Rick has faced all kinds of cosmic horrors and interdimensional threats, but nothing scared him as much as watching reality tear itself apart because of uncertainty. Rick's refusal to do time travel is one of the few times he shows real wisdom and restraint. He learned that some power is too dangerous to use, no matter how smart you are or how good your intentions might be. For Rick, time travel just isn't worth the risk, and A Wrinkle in Time shows us exactly why he feels that way. Now let's break down every Rick who betrayed their Mortys. Remember to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying our content. You know how Rick always acts like he's doing everything for Morty's own good? The Ricklantis mix-up shows us what happens when you take that attitude and spread it across an entire society. This episode is basically a horror story about how Ricks systematically betray, exploit, and destroy their Mortys while convincing themselves they're the good guys. The Citadel of Ricks was supposed to be this amazing place where infinite versions of Rick and Morty could live together in harmony. After our Rick destroyed the Council of Ricks, they rebuilt it as a democracy, where everyone gets a voice. Sounds great on paper, right? But this episode shows us that the whole system is built on Ricks treating Mortys like property, and some Ricks have gotten really creative about betraying their trust. Throughout the episode, we see different levels of Rick betrayal happening everywhere. You've got the obvious stuff like Ricks literally farming other Ricks for their happy memories to make cookies. But then you've got subtler betrayals like Teacher Rick programming Mortys to worship their future Ricks, or the news anchors making fun of candidate Morty for even trying to participate in politics. Every Rick on the Citadel has bought into this idea that Mortys exist to serve them. The most disturbing part is how casual it all feels. When Rick J22 goes on his rampage at the Simple Rick's factory, nobody questions why they're torturing a Rick for cookie flavoring. The SWAT team treats him like a terrorist for objecting to literal brain farming. The factory owner Rick D. Sanchez III gives this whole speech about freedom and Rick solidarity, then immediately shoots Rick J. 22 in the head and hooks him up to the same torture machine. That betrayal hits different because Rick D. Sanchez III makes Rick J. 22 believe he's being saved. He walks him down the assembly line while all the other worker Ricks cheer, talking about how they're going to his new life. Rick J. 22 is crying tears of joy because he thinks he's finally free. Then boom, bullet to the head, straight back into the machine. The factory owner literally weaponized hope to make the betrayal more brutal. But the Rick betrayals go way beyond just lying to other Ricks. The whole education system is designed to betray Mortys from childhood. Teacher Rick spends his days training Mortys to be perfect sidekicks who never question anything. When Slick acts up in class, Teacher Rick immediately brings up how many of his previous Ricks died, using trauma to shame him into compliance. The school exists to break Morty's spirits so they'll never fight back. Even the Mortys who try to work within the system get betrayed. Candidate Morty runs for president with genuine intentions to help his people. He gives this amazing speech about unity and fighting real injustice instead of each other. The crowd loves him, he wins the election, and for a moment it looks like maybe things can change. Then we find out he's actually evil Morty, and he immediately starts murdering everyone who supported the old system. The cops are another level of betrayal entirely. Cop Morty started out as an idealistic police officer who wanted to help his community, but the system corrupted him into becoming everything he originally fought against. He's taking bribes from Big Morty, killing suspects to cover his tracks, and treating other Mortys like animals. When his partner Cop Rick tries to do the right thing, Cop Morty kills him too. The system turned a good Morty into a monster who betrays his own kind. The really sick part is how Cop Morty justifies it all. He tells Cop Rick that Mortys are naturally violent and need to be controlled. He's internalized all the Rick propaganda about Morty inferiority so completely that he can't see how he's been manipulated. Every time he hurts another Morty, he tells himself it's necessary to maintain order. The Citadel brainwashes Mortys into exploiting each other. Big Morty represents another kind of betrayal. He's figured out how to gain power within the system by becoming everything Ricks expect Mortys to be: crude, violent, and obsessed with immediate gratification. He runs prostitution rings and drug operations, feeding off the desperation of Mortys who have nowhere else to turn. Big Morty betrays his own people by profiting from their suffering while keeping them dependent on him. The 4 student Mortys looking for the wishing portal show us the ultimate betrayal. These kids are so desperate to escape their predetermined roles that they're willing to risk everything for a chance at a better life. When Slick throws himself into the portal, he's making the ultimate sacrifice because he believes his wish for change might come true. Instead, the wishing portal is just a garbage chute. The Citadel built a fake hope machine specifically to trick desperate Mortys into killing themselves. That's the most evil Rick betrayal in the whole episode. Some Rick architect looked at all these suffering Mortys and thought, you know what would be funny? Let's build them a fake escape route and watch them throw themselves away. They turned Morty desperation into entertainment. They convinced generations of Mortys that if they just sacrifice enough, their dreams might come true, knowing the whole time it was a lie. The Shadow Council of Ricks represents the final layer of betrayal. These are the Ricks who convinced everyone else to participate in democracy while secretly controlling everything behind the scenes. When President Morty wins the election, Garment District Rick immediately tells him that it doesn't matter who sits in the president's chair because Ricks will always be in charge. He's not even trying to hide the fact that the entire democratic process was a sham, designed to make Mortys feel like they have a voice. But here's where evil Morty's rebellion makes perfect sense. He didn't become evil because he was born that way. He became evil because he saw through all the lies and realized that playing nice would never work. Every Rick who ever betrayed a Morty created the conditions that made evil Morty possible. They taught him that power is the only thing that matters and that anyone who trusts the system is a fool. When evil Morty executes the Shadow Council, he's being logical. These Ricks spent decades betraying Mortys while pretending to care about democracy and freedom. Evil Morty just decided to stop pretending that negotiation was possible. He looked at the system that turned Cop Morty into a killer, that tricked Slick into committing suicide, that tortured Rick J22 for entertainment, and decided it all had to burn. The really disturbing part is how evil Morty uses the same manipulation tactics that Ricks use, just more effectively. He runs a fake campaign talking about unity while secretly planning mass murder. He manipulates campaign manager Morty into becoming an assassin by feeding him selective information. When the assassination fails, he has his own campaign manager killed to cover his tracks. Evil Morty learned from the best he just applied Rick tactics to a larger scale. The episode ends with dozens of dead Ricks and Mortys floating in space around the Citadel. These are the result of systematic betrayal finally reaching its logical conclusion. Every Rick who ever lied to a Morty, every teacher who broke a student's spirit, every cop who took a bribe, every businessman who profited from suffering, they all contributed to creating the monster that destroyed them. The most chilling part is that evil Morty's speech during his campaign was completely genuine. He really did see the problems with their society and wanted to fix them, but the system was so corrupt that the only way to create change was through mass murder. The Rick's betrayals were so complete that they eliminated every peaceful path to reform. Our Rick's reaction at the end is telling too. He's celebrating his adventure in Atlantis while completely ignoring what happened at the Citadel. Even when Morty asks about it directly, Rick dismisses it as having no bearing on their lives. He knows that acknowledging the Citadel means confronting his own patterns of betrayal, so he chooses willful ignorance instead. The episode shows us that Rick betrayal is systematic. Every Rick who treats their Morty as disposable, every Rick who lies about caring while pursuing their own agenda, every Rick who uses their intelligence to manipulate rather than help, they're all part of a culture that makes evil Mortys inevitable. The Citadel didn't create evil Mortys through accident, they created them through betrayal, cruelty, and the arrogant belief that their intelligence gives them the right to control other people's lives. The Ricklantis mix-up is really a story about how betrayal becomes normalized in a society built on inequality. When the smart people convince themselves that everyone else exists to serve them, they create the conditions for their own destruction. Evil Morty is the natural consequence of a system built on lies, exploitation, and the fundamental betrayal of trust between Ricks and Mortys. Now let's move on to every world that Rick has destroyed. You know how Rick always acts like he's this brilliant scientist who can solve any problem? Well, these 3 episodes show us the flip side of that genius. Rick has literally destroyed entire worlds, and he treats it like breaking a coffee mug. What's crazy about Rick is how normal world-ending disasters have become for him. Most people feel terrible if they accidentally step on an ant. Rick has wiped out billions of lives and just moves on to the next adventure like nothing happened. The whole mess in Rick Potion number 9 starts with something totally innocent. Morty wants to ask Jessica to dance. Rick whips up a love potion using chemicals from voles, these little rodents that mate for life. Sounds simple enough, right? But Jessica has the flu. So when Morty uses the potion on her, it becomes airborne and spreads to everyone at the dance. Suddenly, literally everyone on Earth is obsessed with Morty and wants to have sex with him. We're talking about the entire human population becoming these creepy, lovesick stalkers chasing after a 14-year-old kid. Rick's first fix involves using praying mantis DNA, because mantises are supposedly the opposite of voles they mate once and then kill their partner. But Rick's biology knowledge isn't as good as he thinks because this just makes everyone want to have sex with Morty and then eat him. So now the whole planet is full of cannibalistic sex monsters. When that doesn't work, Rick throws together DNA from koalas, rattlesnakes, chimpanzees, cactuses, sharks, golden retrievers, and dinosaurs. When Morty points out that this makes no sense, Rick gets all defensive and says, "What, you want me to show you my math?" He's basically admitting he has no idea what he's doing and is just mixing random stuff together. The result? Every human on Earth gets turned into these disgusting Cronenberg monsters, twisted blobs of flesh with multiple faces and limbs sticking out everywhere. Rick has literally transformed 7 billion people into living nightmares. But here's the really wild part. Instead of trying to fix this disaster, Rick just decides to abandon that entire reality and hop over to a dimension where he solved the problem but then died in an accident. They can just replace their dead alternate selves and pretend nothing happened. The scene where Rick and Morty are burying their own corpses in the backyard is genuinely unsettling. Rick's giving Morty this casual lecture about infinite realities while they're literally disposing of their own dead bodies. When Morty asks about the world they left behind, Rick just says, "Don't think about it," which is basically his answer to everything. Meanwhile, back in the Cronenberg world, Jerry, Beth, and Summer are living in this post-apocalyptic wasteland fighting monsters just to survive. But they're actually happier as a family, because Rick isn't around to mess things up. Jerry's become this confident warrior, Beth actually respects him, and Summer feels secure. Rick leaving was the best thing that ever happened to them, even though his presence destroyed their entire world. Childrick of Mort shows Rick destroying things on a more personal level. He gets this call from Gaia, who's apparently a sentient planet that Rick had sex with. She's giving birth to thousands of his children, and they're all screaming, "I am," because that's what happens when you combine Rick's DNA with anything. You get beings who are obsessed with themselves. Beth wants to help raise these kids, so she and Rick build this whole civilization from scratch. They set up schools, job programs, social systems, basically playing God with thousands of lives. The kids grow up super fast and develop their own society. But then this other god shows up claiming to be the real father. He's like a discount Zeus who criticizes Rick and Beth's parenting style, saying they made the kids soft and empty inside, and their city is a monument to nothing. He wants to give the children faith and purpose instead of Rick's cold scientific approach. Rick's response to being criticized as a parent? He immediately starts a fight with an actual god. They have this massive battle that destroys most of the city, while the children they're supposedly fighting over are getting killed by falling buildings. Neither of them seems to care that their ego match is literally murdering their kids. The fight ends when Summer and Morty accidentally crash a spaceship into the god's head, killing him instantly. So now thousands of Rick's children are orphans, their civilization is in ruins, and Rick's reaction is to make jokes about cleaning god guts off the buildings. When Gaia kicks Rick out for causing all this destruction, Rick acts like she's being unreasonable. He tells her, "I'm the guy that showed up," as if showing up gives him permission to destroy everything. Rick genuinely thinks his participation entitles him to cause unlimited damage. Rick-dependent spray might be Rick's most embarrassing world-ending disaster. The whole thing starts because Morty's been using a horse breeding machine at Beth's hospital for, personal purposes. Rick accidentally turns Morty's sperm into giant monsters by exposing them to interdimensional energy. But he doesn't know where the sperm came from because Morty's too embarrassed to tell him. When Rick asks if there's anything he should know about the sperm, Morty panics and lies. This means Rick has to solve the crisis with completely wrong information, thinking they're dealing with alien invaders instead of his grandson's DNA. The giant sperm monsters start attacking cities, building weapons and organizing military campaigns. The president calls Rick to fix it, and Rick's plan is just to nuke everything in the Grand Canyon. But when they get there, the sperm have gotten smarter. They're using tools and working together. The government's backup plan is to create a giant human egg to attract all the sperm to one place. But they use Summer's egg without knowing the sperm belongs to her brother, which means they're about to create a giant incest baby that could end the world. The president keeps making jokes while accidentally setting up an even worse disaster. By the time Morty admits the truth, it's too late to stop anything. Rick has to team up with underground cannibalistic horse people to fight the sperm army, but Summer's egg gets launched into space anyway and creates a giant space baby that threatens astronauts. What makes all this so disturbing is Rick's attitude. He never shows real remorse or tries to learn from these disasters. When the love potion goes wrong, he blames Morty for not mentioning Jessica's flu. When his god fight destroys his children's city, he acts like Gaia's being unfair for kicking him out. When the sperm crisis threatens humanity, he focuses on avoiding embarrassment instead of preventing catastrophe. Rick has this whole philosophy about infinite realities that lets him avoid responsibility for anything. Every time he destroys a world, he can point to some other reality where things worked out and act like the destroyed world doesn't matter. He's turned mass destruction into math where individual suffering becomes meaningless. The scary part is how this attitude spreads to everyone around Rick. Morty starts making jokes while burying their own corpses. The president treats the sperm crisis like comedy, even while people are dying. Jerry starts parroting Rick's cynical ideas about love being just chemicals. Rick destroys people's ability to care about destruction. He spreads this infection of apathy that makes everyone treat world-ending disasters like minor inconveniences. Even when people try to hold him accountable, he either escapes to another reality or manipulates the situation until everyone forgets why they were angry. You can see Rick getting more casual about these disasters over time. In Rick Potion number 9, he seems slightly bothered before deciding to abandon the Cronenberg world. In Childrick of Mort, he treats his children's destroyed civilization like a minor setback. In Rick-dependent Spray, he's cracking jokes while the crisis is still happening. Rick's developed this whole system for dealing with apocalyptic disasters. Deny responsibility, blame someone else, make jokes to deflect criticism, and if all else fails, just portal away to somewhere else. He's turned world-ending catastrophes into routine maintenance. But the most disturbing part is how this affects his family. Every time Rick causes a disaster, he forces his family to either help cover it up or abandon people they care about. Morty has to leave behind the Cronenberg world where his original family is fighting to survive. Beth has to watch her planet children become orphans because of Rick's ego. Summer has to live knowing there's a giant incest baby in space because of her grandfather's experiments. Rick's casual attitude toward destruction affects his family's ability to form healthy relationships with anything. How can you get attached to your community when Grandpa might turn everyone into monsters? How can you invest in relationships when you might have to abandon your entire reality? These episodes show that Rick has completely separated himself from the consequences of his actions. He treats entire civilizations like disposable experiments in his personal laboratory. The scariest part is how normal this has become to everyone around him. The really messed up thing is that Rick's world-destroying habit has created this whole ecosystem of enablers around him. Take the president in Rick-dependent Spray. Instead of being horrified that Rick accidentally created giant sperm monsters, he's making jokes about space dicks and coming up with ridiculous names like Skeet Boogans. The leader of the free world is treating an extinction-level event like a comedy roast. Even worse, Rick's family has learned to normalize his destructive behavior. When Beth finds out about the Cronenberg world in later episodes, she doesn't freak out about Rick abandoning billions of mutant people to die. She's more concerned about whether she herself might be a clone. Summer and Morty have gotten so used to Rick's disasters that they barely react when entire civilizations get wiped out during their adventures. The Cronenberg episode is especially dark when you think about what Rick and Morty left behind. Jerry, Beth, and Summer are living in this post-apocalyptic hellscape, but they've actually become better people because of it. Jerry's no longer the pathetic loser everyone made fun of. He's this confident warrior protecting his family. Beth respects him for the first time in years. Summer feels loved and secure in ways she never did before. Rick's presence in their lives was so toxic that even living in a world full of flesh monsters was an improvement. The family Rick abandoned became stronger, happier, and more united than the family he stayed with. That says something pretty disturbing about Rick's impact on the people around him. What makes Rick's casual attitude toward destruction even more disturbing is how he's trained everyone to think like him. In the Cronenberg reality, there's a version of Rick and Morty who are also Cronenberg monsters. At the end of the episode, we see them talking about how they genetically Cronenberged world beyond repair and turned everyone into regular, normal people. Even the monster versions of themselves have adopted Rick's twisted logic where mass transformation is just another day at the office. The planet children in Childrick of Mort represent something even sadder: Rick's complete inability to be a parent without causing massive destruction. Beth gets so invested in building this civilization because she sees it as a chance to do parenting, right? To create something meaningful with her father? For a brief moment, it looks like Rick might actually care about being a good father and grandfather. But Rick can't handle any criticism of his parenting style, even from another godlike being. The moment someone suggests that maybe turning children into efficient workers isn't the best approach to child rearing, Rick's ego kicks in, and he has to prove he's the alpha. The fight that destroys the children's city happens literally over their heads while they're trying to live their lives. The saddest part is watching those planet children build their society only to see it get demolished because their father figures can't have an adult conversation about parenting styles. Rick creates life just to destroy it because he can't stand being told he's wrong about anything. Rick Dependence Spray shows us how Rick's destructive habits have gotten so routine that he just manages disasters instead of preventing them. When the giant sperms start attacking, Rick's not horrified that his grandson's DNA has become a world-threatening monster. He's annoyed that he has to deal with it, and embarrassed that the situation makes him look bad. The whole Chud subplot in that episode is Rick at his most manipulative. He lies to an entire underground civilization, pretends to fall in love with their princess, and convinces them to go to war just to clean up his mess. Then when it's over, he abandons his new wife and their instantly born child without a second thought. Rick uses entire species as disposable resources to solve problems he created. But maybe the most disturbing aspect of Rick's world-destroying pattern is how it's affected his relationship with science itself. Rick talks about being a scientist, but real scientists are supposed to learn from their mistakes and try to minimize harm. Rick treats science like a toy. If an experiment goes wrong and kills billions of people, oh well, there are infinite realities where it worked out fine. Rick has turned the scientific method into a game where consequences don't matter because he can always find a reality where his hypothesis was correct. He's just playing with forces he doesn't fully understand and letting other people deal with the fallout. The portal gun has made Rick into the universe's worst scientist because it's removed all accountability from his work. A normal scientist who accidentally created Cronenberg monsters would spend the rest of their life trying to fix that mistake. Rick just hops to a dimension where he didn't screw up and calls it a day. This is why Rick's world-destroying habit is so much worse than just being a mad scientist who makes mistakes. Rick has systematically removed himself from any responsibility for the consequences of his actions. He's created this perfect system where he gets all the fun of playing with dangerous science and none of the obligation to clean up his messes. The really terrifying implication is that there are probably hundreds of other realities where Rick has caused similar disasters and just moved on. The 3 episodes we see are just the ones that happen to affect the Rick we're following. There could be dozens of Cronenberg worlds, hundreds of destroyed planet children civilizations, and countless other species that got wiped out because Rick was having a bad day. Rick has destroyed so many worlds that it's just another day at work for him. He's got procedures, jokes, and philosophical justifications for why it doesn't matter. He's turned world-ending disasters into paperwork, and that casual cruelty might be more terrifying than any monster he's ever created. That's all for today. If you enjoyed our video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.